Fear, the woman in the lab coat said as she led me up the anonymous white hallway. It lights up their eyes. Ever seen a cow facing down a bolt gun? A chicken as it's stuffed through a slaughter cone? They're aware. They know what's happening, and it gives them flavor. It's a messed up truth, but it's just that, a truth. Our test tube meat is good, but it'll never taste the same without God's greatest seasoning, fear of the end. And that's what you need me for, I asked her, feeling vulnerable in my skin-tight bodysuit. The fear? I had signed up for a paid clinical trial for a lab-grown meat producer, but other than a vague orientation-style briefing that left me more questions than answers, I was in the dark. I'd been made to sign a mountain of paperwork, non-disclosure agreements, liability waivers, and who knows what, but for the amount of money they were paying me, I didn't really care what I would be lab ratting. I was a broke college student, after all, and ramen 7 days a week will drive anyone to desperation. That's right, Amelia, the woman said. Essentially, we'll be dumping you in a very frightening simulation. It'll scare the hell out of you, but that's why you're getting paid, right? In turn, we harvest your fear, use it to give our artificial meat an authentic taste. Dr. Moore looked back at me, smiled. She had a good face, a kind face, dark hair, hard eyes, a tough woman, but warm, inviting. Her smile was meant to set me at ease. It didn't. I was anxious, full of questions. I blew a sigh. If you have that technology, couldn't you just fake it? I asked. Or manufacture the fear, or use animals, or something. She chuckled, shook her head. That would be cheaper, and make my job a hell of a lot easier. Unfortunately, Mother Nature fights the goodwill of men every chance she gets. Before I could ask for more, we hit a door, and entered the fear harvest. It was a wide, windowless laboratory, sterile white surfaces, blinding overhead lights, linoleum floors, which looked like clean. A long counter-style desk ran along the opposite wall. It was busied by monitors, desktop computers, and a few lab coat-bound techs hunched over keyboards. The real attraction, however, stood at the far end of the room, the simulation chamber. It was a closed-off, CT scan-like tube with a thick stream of colorful wires, each the size of my wrist, running from the top. The wires coiled around the base, disappearing somewhere into the floor. Darth, Dr. Moore called, a gawky, pimply tech hiding behind glasses the size of VW bug headlights looked up at her. Are we set? She asked him. We're good, Dr. Moore, Darth replied. She nodded, gestured me over to the simulation chamber. She hit a button, and the cylinder split up on a hinge, revealing the gelatinous mold that I was meant to lie in. It'll feel real, Dr. Moore said, and it'll be upsetting, highly distressing. Keeping track of things can be disorienting, confusing to some. The system monitors your heart rate, stress levels, and breathing, and makes small adjustments accordingly, tailoring the experience to make it scarier. You'll feel everything, smell, and taste the world as if it were there. So it's like AI, I asked. She gave me a slight smile. That didn't answer my question. I swallowed. I think Moore must have read the look of raw dread on my face, because she quickly produced a little handle that reminded me of a Wii remote. It was crowned with a small red button. Don't worry, she cooed. If it becomes too overwhelming, you can hit this button at any time, and we'll pull you right out. I accepted the handle, the remote, whatever the hell it was. But even if you can endure it, she continued, and don't need the button, and trust me, some don't. We'll take you out after an hour. I paused, sensing something more there. And what happens if I stay in longer than an hour? She faltered. That won't happen. I could see she was hiding something, woefully ignoring important information that might affect my decision to step into that chamber. I know, but if it does, I asked, slightly uneasy. Don't worry about that, she said with a tight smile. You'll do fine. It was dark and cold in the simulation chamber. I laid in the soft, sticky embrace of the gelatinous mold. It felt like sweaty skin. Amelia, Dr. Moore's voice in my ear, loud, beating out of the chamber itself. You can hear me, but I can't hear you. We're about to initiate the submersion sequence. You may start to feel dizzy, but just try and relax. I sucked air, blew a deep breath. My heartbeat steadily rose from a trot to a gallop, pounding my ribcage so hard I was sure it would bruise. Okay, Moore continued. Here goes. Good luck, Amelia. She began a 10-second countdown that was drowned out as a great thrumming built. It sounded like I was inside a jet engine as it screamed to life before takeoff. After a moment, the great thrum began to fade, just enough for me to pick out more, counting. 3, 2, 1. Then I was blasted into silence. It was that abrupt, like a switch was thrown. All at once I was in a quiet, still place. Where was I? Somewhere, nowhere, a black abyss. I looked around. I was weightlessly suspended, floating in the great black nowhere. It was like outer space, but without the stars. The air around me was alive. I felt it move through me, felt it pulling me in a dozen different directions, like it was trying to devour me piece for piece. It was awful. It felt wrong, felt unholy, like the very existence of this empty place was an abomination. And I thought I could hear, but then the world solidified and I was on the ground, clumpy soil, and dead grass digging into my palms and knees. It felt like salvation after that empty place. I tried to rise, couldn't. The world swam around me nauseatingly. My equilibrium was shot. After a moment of sawing cold air through my lungs, the nausea receded enough for me to take my bearings. I rose to my feet and sucked in the scenery. It was night. I stood in the center of some kind of a clearing, an empty field of dead grass beneath my feet. There were trees behind me. I couldn't see them, but I knew they were there. Awful black trees. And I knew there were things hiding in those trees. Things with sharp teeth and too many eyes. A chill bit through my jacket. When had I gotten a jacket? I'd entered the chamber like a surfer in a seal suit and had come out in a windbreaker and jeans. They were more ripped than jeans, but what the hell? I wasn't worried about my jeans or my windbreaker. I was worried about the city, the field in which I stood edged to a black river, a rush of terrible slimy waters fighting their way downstream. But no, I saw it wasn't water at all. It was eels. A writhing mass of eels flowing like liquid, churning in on themselves in a great knot of squirming black rope. The river of serpents surrounded the ruins of a metropolis. It could have been any American city after eating a nuclear blast. But it wasn't any city, it was my city. The blackened husks of skyscrapers etched themselves out of the night sky. Smoke rose from mountains of concrete and steel. There was no fire. Fire would have meant warmth, and there was no warmth in this world. It was a cold, dead place. My heart was hammering my ribcage. My stomach fluttered, a swirl with sickening dread. I could feel fear begin rooting me down, paralyzing me in place. Thunder growled somewhere far away, and a clap of lightning illuminated a horror beyond my worst nightmares. Silhouetted it just past the city on the horizon, if only for an instant. It was an emaciated, human-like creature, taller than the tallest skyscraper, all elbows and kneecaps, its spindly, stick-like arms topped by long, clawed hands which hung as narrow and slender as the rest of its form. Its skin was the color of soot, ashy and black, flaking and peeling in places to reveal raw, pink flesh like a burned victim. Encasing its head was a rusted box, the size of a mansion, packed with ventilation holes. From those perforations uttered an earth-shuddering buzz, like a colony of flies devouring a moldering corpse. Deafening, the noise punched through me, rattling my lungs, shaking my bones through my horror-frozen flesh. Then a black cloud exploded from the ventilation holes. At least I thought it was a black cloud. But as it funneled out of the box head and came spiraling towards me, I saw this was no cloud at all. It was hundreds, thousands of dog-sized spiders, winged and airborne, hissing through trembling feelers as they bombed towards me from over the city skyline. The lightning had faded, and with it the impossible box-headed creature that had lent this world its destruction. I was thankful for that. Had I been forced to look at that thing any longer, I was afraid my mind would just drain away. But the thick black cloud was surging closer, and I knew I had to move. I knew I had to run, but I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I was numb. I was captured in amber, encased in a heavy adhesive that glued me in place. My lungs were collapsing in on themselves. My heart was running faster than any heart should. I couldn't do this. I reached for the handle, ready to press the red button. I didn't care about the money, didn't care about anything other than escaping this dreadful waste world. While I still held my sanity, the handle wasn't there. A desperate whimper rose up my throat like a slide flute. I frantically patted down my pockets, scanned the ground around me. There was no handle. There was no red button which would yank me from this nightmare like a bleeding alarm clock. I was trapped, the horde of flight spiders closing in. Almost here, I could hear a shrill chittering pulsing out of their bulbous, hairy bodies. their delicate, housefly-like wings trembling and beating, carrying them towards me. I had to move right now. I tried to remind myself that this was a simulation, but I couldn't. This was real, and I was going to die. And, in the end, it turned out I wasn't far off. So in that moment I dug deep, deep into my lungs. I sucked air into them, and boiled that air into a roar. It was a war cry, a declaration of survival. It shot from my lips, and with it a surge of energy blasted through me. I turned and ran. I had been right, there were trees behind me. The field was hemmed by a wall of black woods. They were like soldiers of the night, lined up for battle, drenched in shadow. I didn't like it, but I had nowhere else to run, so I ran toward the trees, my legs scissoring, my breath whip cracking through aching lungs. I ran, and I never looked back. The woods were a lie, and I nearly tumbled off a cliff. It was some kind of crazed, forced perspective. There was no forest, just a thin line of twisted trees separating the field from the lip of a massive, crumbling canyon. I jerked back as the world disintegrated beneath my feet, clumps of rock pulling loose, and skipping off into the great abyss. I grabbed hold of the nearest tree, stared out in disbelief at the Grand Canyon like nightmare. On the other side, across the mile-wide gap, stood an empty, arid wasteland. A haze of ash hung over the blistered desert expanse. There was nothing but a single building, a brutalist cube of white that looked like a Soviet-era hospital. I recognized it immediately. It was Orion Laboratories, the company I was working for, the producer of the lab-grown meat. The building was dark, abandoned, except for a single light beating out through one of the second floor's rectangular windows. I looked down at the drop and felt my stomach lurch dizzyingly. I hated heights, couldn't stand them, and I was trapped over one, the hissing wave of flight-bound spiders surging closer, closer. That's when I saw the rowboat, sitting up against the tree beside mine. The boat was ancient, made of splinters and rusty nails. Painted in crooked, uneven letters on its single sun-warped oar was one word: row. What the hell? There was nothing to row on. It was empty space, a mile of vast, empty space. But that word struck a chord deep within my subconscious, and I knew exactly what it meant. It was insane, crazy, but I couldn't see any other choice. So I leaned over, hanging onto my tree for dear life, and gave the boat a shove. It rocked, fighting gravity, before tipping onto its belly and sliding down over the abyss. But instead of plummeting, it floated, like it had found an invisible face of water. It rocked slightly, buoyant on nothing. I couldn't move, couldn't believe what I was seeing. Then the boat started to drift, moving out over the drop, floating out of reach. My hand shot out for the oar, and used it to fish the boat back to shore. I hesitated, certain that when my foot hit the boat it would drop like an elevator with a broken cable. But then I heard the rising hiss of those flight-bound spiders, and I was forced into motion. I planted one foot in the boat, then the other. My hands white-knuckled a gnarl of tree roots for leverage, the only thing between me and certain death if I felt the world drop out from under me. But the boat held solid, floating on liquid air that felt remarkably like water. I released the tree roots, pulling a deep, shuddering breath as I relinquished control to the boat beneath my feet. But the boat didn't sink, and I rowed. I made it halfway across the canyon before the cloud of spiders descended me like a hurricane. They hissed down out of the sky, wheeling towards me in an awful cloud. I rowed harder, harder, the other side of the canyon closing in. Wham! A spider hammered into me. The boat yawed dizzyingly, threatening to capsize and send me tumbling down into the abyss. I cracked down on the creature with my oar. It reeled off hissing, its many legs paddling the air. Another replaced it, barreling in like a hell-bent kamikaze pilot. I choked up on the oar and swung like a demon. The spider's body crackled beneath my blow, one delicate wing crumpling in on its hairy form. It floundered off, trying to regain flight, couldn't, and was sent shrieking down into the abyss. The cloud of spiders solidified, yes, solidified, coming together as a massive black wall of bodies in the sky. In one coordinated effort of raw, animal hatred, the wall of creatures came crashing down. It was like the heavens were collapsing in on this ruined world, a solid shadow on an inexorable collision course with my stranded boat. There was nothing to do but accept it. Whatever was about to happen was out of my hands. I sighed, an agonal breath of sorts, a living death rattle of submission. I crushed my body down, pressing myself small. In the boat, I waited to die. My breath was shallow and intoxicating in my lungs. My heart was beating so hard I couldn't hear anything, couldn't hear the impossible rumble, but I felt it. It throbbed up through the bottom of the boat, trembling out from beneath me. The spider cloud heard it too, and pulled back, withdrawing up into the sky in a chorus of frightened shrieks, leaving me to wait. No, the rumble. I heard it now, ear-splitting, the growl of something huge, something ineffable, and it was rising up from the abyss beneath me. I didn't dare peer over the edge of the boat. I was afraid of what I might see, or what I might not. I was afraid that if I looked down it would freeze me in place, paralyze me, so I straightened up, pulled a lungful of dry air, and I rowed. I rowed like my life depended on it, my oar cutting through the invisible liquid and pulling me forward. The rumbling grew, the biggest noise I'd ever heard, rattling my teeth, shaking my brain in its pan. It was the deafening report of continents shifting, of mountains rising from the earth and falling back into it. The boat was jumping beneath me, dancing like I was on a fault line, as an earthquake tore through Mother Nature's belly. I couldn't slow now, I was almost there, fighting invisible waves, riding and cresting hidden waters as I closed in on the other side of the canyon. Once or twice I felt myself lift off the rowboat's seat, certain I would blink and find myself plunging down into the canyon, but I didn't, and I hit solid ground just as the rumbling stopped. I hauled the boat ashore and watched as the canyon bore the biggest thing I'd ever seen. A mass of skyscraper-sized tentacles grew out of the darkness, fingering up into the sky. The spider cloud was still circling overhead. They tried to disperse as the great canyon god rose from its throne. One of the tentacles batted through the cloud, sending hundreds of dead flight spiders raining down into the seam. The darkness accepted the offering gratefully, swallowing the spiders as the tentacles finished off the splintered cloud. I stood by and watched the sky rain monsters. It was Dr. Moore's voice. I had made it into Orion Laboratories and now stood in the darkened lobby. It was gutted, like a grizzly bear had torn through this place. Claw marks shredded through walls, revealing thick runs of wire and tufted insulation. The reception desk was a mess of splintered wood, completely torn apart, but I heard her voice, belting out through the public announcement system, running on a loop, echoing through the empty hospital-like halls of Orion Labs. It was Dr. Moore, and I wasn't relieved. I was terrified. What she was saying ran my blood cold. "Amelia," she said, her voice urgent. "If you're hearing this, I need you to listen closely. This is not a drill. This is not part of the simulation. There's been a problem. We can't pull you out. The computer, there was a malfunction." Her voice was laced with fear. Yes, the hardened woman who I thought could take anything sounded terrified. I promise we're doing everything we can to get you out before 3 o'clock, she continued. I looked up at a shattered wall clock. I was 2:58. I had gone into the simulation at exactly 2. I was nearing the dreaded hour. But if not, I need you to listen to me. There is a replica of the simulation chamber in room B13. That's upstairs. If you can reach it, you should be able to manually send yourself back. But if you, she trailed off, couldn't bring herself to say the words. But if you don't, your conscious mind will assimilate itself into the simulation, slowly at first, starting just past the hour, but it gains momentum rapidly, like a snowball racing downhill. Your body on the outside will live, but you'll be fried, a vegetable, brain activity nil, and you, the real you, will continue to live on in the simulation. If we turn it off, it'll kill your conscious mind. If we restart it, it'll be the same. I hope you're hearing this. I pray you make it in time. Godspeed, Amelia. The clock hit 2:59. I tore a fire map off the wall and ran like hell. It was a blur of anonymous white hallways, a maze of identical corridors. The fire map led me up a flight of stairs, past a dead exit sign, past a doorway barricaded with stockpiled chairs, and down another hallway. A ticking clock seemed to chase me as I went. Tick-tock, tick-tock. I hit room B13 and slammed into an exact copy of the laboratory that had sent me here. The room was pristine, bathed in blinding sodium light. My gaze caught a wall clock, 2 hours, 59 minutes, and 48 seconds. I had 12 seconds. I didn't feel myself move, but I did. I pounded over to the simulation chamber, hit a button. The chamber split open on a hinge, revealing the gelatinous mold. 5 seconds. I climbed in. I was crying now. Tears, hot and salty, cut warm lines down my cheeks. 3 seconds. I laid down and pounded the button. The chamber sucked shut, sealing me in. 1 second. I was immediately swallowed in the great, powerful hum that indicated my transgression to. From the simulation, it built and built until it was unbearable, and just as abruptly cracked into silence. Deep, deafening silence. After a moment, the chamber yawned open with a hiss of hydraulics. Harsh light blazed in and seared my eyes. Dr. Moore's voice greeted me. "Amelia," she said. A wave of relief washed over me like rapture. The giant that had been sitting on my chest stood up and walked away. I staggered out of the chamber, looked around. I was in the empty laboratory. Dr. Moore's voice piped in over the public announcement system. "If you're hearing this," she said with that same terrified urgency, "I need you to listen closely. This is not a drill." I looked up at the clock. It was 3:01. There was a malfunction. Your conscious mind will assimilate itself. Starting just past the hour, your body will be fried. Your mind will live on in the simulation. I stood in the empty laboratory, trapped in the nightmare, listening as Dr. Moore spelled out my fate, and watched the clock slam 3:02. Silence slapped me in the face. It was immediate and startling. Moore's public announcement loop had cut out. Mid-sentence, I think, though I can't say for sure. I hadn't really been hearing it. But now that her voice was gone, I missed the company. I felt alone, like a long-lost boy stranded in stormy waters, carried further and further from land by the whims of an angry ocean. I couldn't think. I sucked air, hoping a lungful would burn away the fog that had settled in over my mind, hoping I could force myself into a plan of action. But who was I kidding? I was out of my depths, shipwrecked in hell. Why'd I think I could do this? Why'd I think I could? Dr. Moore's voice jolted me out of my head. "Amelia," she said. I flinched, startled, then relaxed, anticipating a repeat of the same SOS she'd given me before. But it wasn't the same message. It was a new one. "You're not back," she said, "which means the link between the two simulation chambers is severed. I promise we're working like hell to bring you home. If you burned all the Ivy League degrees in this room, you could warm a developing country." Her trace of spirit was meant to cheer me up, but all it did was tug on my longing for the outside. "Every second counts," she continued urgently. "You know that more than anyone right now, and I'm sure watching the march of time is killing you. So here's what you can do. There's a manual marriage switch in the basement. The simulation was built from the inside out, and the developers implemented the switch as a safety net, ensuring that if they ever got caught inside, they'd have an escape. If you can make it to the basement and throw the switch, we're in business." She drew a long, trembling breath. "Be vigilant, Amelia. Be careful. Keep your guard up and your ears open. The things in there can hurt and maim and kill. And remember to." Then the speakers hissed, and the message started over again. The clock struck 3:03. I stood in the nightmare and wished life were a palindrome. There were no clocks in my descent through the bowels of Orion Laboratories. I was in one of those service stairwells that scissors back and forth, economically stacked to fit an elevator-sized shaft. I took the rusty stairs down 2 at a time, guided by the watery beam of a flashlight I'd snatched from the lab. I was nearly at the bottom. I could decipher a massive rust door marking the basement entrance, the kind of door you'd see on a ship or submarine, hinges the size of bricks, a wheel handle like a car tire. I was nearly there. 20 steps, 15, 10. Then the smell hit me, punched me in the face. Thick and humid, the ripe stench of a swamp. It was marshy and suffocating. It stung my eyes, scorched my throat like acid. I gagged and palmed my jacket over my nose and mouth. I jerked to a stop on the penultimate landing, forced back by that ungodly reek. I played my light over the sub-level and saw something that flooded me with disgust. An ocean of greenish, stagnant water drowned out the bottom floor, the sort of still, lifeless pond that breeds all manner of awful things, skinned by thick sheets of swamp gunk which drifted like flow. My legs weren't solid objects anymore. They were jelly. My stomach twisted in on itself. My eyes were burning, but I couldn't close them. I was afraid that if I did, I would see the slithering swamp things that were rooting around beneath the water's cloudy surface. No, I fought those thoughts away, prodded them off with a 20-foot pole. Dr. Moore's words replaced them, clanging through my mind. "Every second counts," she had said. "Every second." And I just wasted a whole lot of seconds. I moved before I could lose my nerve, pounded down the remaining stairs. and, without much thought or dramatics, plunged my feet into the rotten water. The runoff, tepid and sticky, rose to my shins, turning my lower legs into slimy logs. It soaked through my jeans, flooded my shoes, swallowed my socks. I cringed at the way it made my legs feel heavier, like they were weighed down by a layer of disease. Wincing, I waded over to the metal door. The thing was made of rust. It was a tetanus factory. Huge flakes of the stuff, as big as my face, were peeling off like dead skin. I planted my hands on the handle without much hope. There was no chance this thing would turn. It would simply refuse, welded shut by rust and time, and then I'd be left to wallow in my own swampy demise. But the handle spun like it had been greased yesterday. Didn't even squeal, the way old metal sometimes does. I slipped the handle in a smooth circuit that was as silent as a gliding paper airplane, and when the handle could turn no more, I pulled. Now the door squealed, shrieked on abused hinges as it shifted open. A rush of egregious water came gurgling out. As the door opened, the smell of swamp slapped me, so violently overwhelming I thought I would faint. It rode the wave of water, choking the stairwell like noxious gas. I reeled back and gagged, folding over as a hot rush of vomit came roaring up. I painted the water and puke. It floated there, joining other islands of filth. Once I was sure I wouldn't keel over again, I wiped my mouth, spit, looked up, and beamed my flashlight at the door. The run of water had slowed to a trickle. It had risen to my knees. If it went any higher, I wasn't sure I could take it. I exhaled, tried to think of nice things. Couldn't. The air was sticky, warm, a hot blanket wrapped tight around my body. I noticed with vague detachment that I had sweated down my clothes. They clung to my flesh like a second skin, or maybe more like a malignancy, trying to smother the life out of me. I hesitated, spit once more, pulled a big dose of swamp air through my lungs, and waded off through the rusty door. There was a forest in the basement. The swamp water, I saw, was a contained moat separating the doorway and the industrial cinder block wall running through it. From a stand of twisted, gnarled trees, it was like a grim fairy tale, an awful place from a blood-soaked fable. The wood within the basement. I stood there, looking at the impossible forest, wondering where it had come from. A soft blanket of fog heaved over damp soil, flowing like a river over knotted tree roots. There were pine trees, tall, ancient things, battle-scarred, but heavy with needles. I was hesitant to advance them. Then I felt something slither by my leg, as smooth and gentle as a lover's caress. I made a horrified sound, and rushed up to dry land, relishing the feeling of firm, solid footing beneath me. I looked back at the water lapping at the cinder block wall and feeding in through the doorway. Nothing moved, nothing that I could see anyway. I turned back to the trees and took the view. The forest was real, endless, a sprawling wood tucked into the world beneath Orion Laboratories. There was a night sky above my head. It looked authentic enough, with twinkling stars and an icy rind of moon. But when I pinned it with my flashlight, I saw it was a flat, solid object, like the heavens were, in fact. The basement ceiling 20 feet overhead. It was a cool parlor trick, looked genuine, but I didn't much care. I scanned the area for a switch which might get me the hell out of here. I was met with nothing but trees. Sheets of pine boughs dangled overhead, like bristly fingers. I could feel dead needles crunching underfoot as I moved, like walking on insects. Tangles of forest brush filled out the rest of the world, everything caked in moss and mushrooms and who knows what from an eon of forged history, and it lasted forever, stretched endlessly, as far as I could see. But there was no mother switch, or marriage switch, or whatever the hell she had called it. There was just trees. I learned there were other things, too. I met them just a few moments later. It looked like some kind of terrible doll, 3 feet high, its body loose and jointed, its skin clumpy and uneven like paper mache. I had been moving forward as quickly as I could. The fog masked the ground, and I didn't dare run for fear of wrenching an ankle. Then I heard it, scampering after me. I whirled around, and the doll-like creature stalking me dropped like a puppet with its strings cut. 1 second it had been lurching forward, hurrying along after me, but the instant my gaze pinned it, it crumpled like a sack of grain. It was a loose pile of limbs. Its back, I saw, was bulbous and misshapen, like a small hunchback of glue and clotted paper. Its face was dumb and blank, shelved forehead over dead, glassy eyes, like a sculpture done by the challenged kid in art class. My lungs were tight, swollen beneath my ribs, leaving no room for my thundering heart. I could feel my throat closing up as I inched toward the thing, the horrible, deformed thing, the messed up, inbred homunculus that walked like a puppet but had no strings with which to walk. A forest walker. I heard a branch snap behind me. I spun around, leveled my flashlight. 2 more puppets hit the ground. They dropped when you saw them and moved when you didn't. More on my right. I spun. 3 puppets dropped. I looked to my left. 4 puppets fell. By the time I heard movement behind me, it was already too late. The first doll thing grabbed me from behind, sinking the little razors tucked into its molded hands, into my thighs. A bolt of agony lit up my side as the thing began to tear and shred like a kid pulling wrapping off a Christmas gift. I shrieked, tried to rip the doll thing off, but its barbed nails were driven in through nerves, and gristle caught and embedded like fishhooks. I screamed, spun, turned, whirled like a dog chasing its tail, trying to get a look at this thing, trying to get it to drop. Tears blurred my vision. I couldn't see it over my jacket. I was screaming as I reached behind, tried to get a grip on the thing, couldn't. I batted its destructive hands with my flashlight, which only nailed its claws deeper into my flesh. The horde of forest dolls closed in, too many of them, everywhere at once, lurching, staggering, limping forward like small, broken puppets, surrounding me. Dozens, scores, like the misfit orphans creeping out of the damp cellar at playtime. Great waves of them dropped as I spun, and then they'd rise again, and drop once more. I screamed, shrieked until I thought my brain would rupture. Blood warmed my legs, ran down my thighs, and filled my shoes. I was one hot burst of agony. The dolls closed in, like a psycho game of red light, green light, moving when I wasn't looking, dropping when I was. They were going to engulf me, swarm me like an army of ants usurping a fallen beetle. Then I caught my own, pale, pain-torn reflection in the silver lens of the flashlight, my eyes bright and wide with fear, my hair a damp, sweaty mess, and past my own warped reflection, I saw the thing clinging onto me. It dropped like a stone. As its claws tore free, a bolt of adrenaline roared through my veins like I'd just mainlined the stuff. I forced myself into motion, fought my body into a blind, full-tilt crash run through the army of puppets. Razor nails scraped and clawed and tore my legs to ribbons. I fought aside waves of the awful, misshapen things whose skin was so much like poorly molded clay. I bled and I ran. The horde pursued, but their diminutive, stumpy legs were no match for my strides, and soon I had outrun them. I jumped logs, dodged branches, batting them past on my way under. I ran until my legs were cold and aching, and nothing but red. I ran until my lungs screamed, and my heart did too. I ran until I saw the ladder and the big metal switch above it. I stopped, looked up in disbelief. There was a ladder in the middle of the forest. A wooden rung ladder, as naked and pristine as the day it was carved, rose in a perfect vertical line from the forest floor to the little twist of moon overhead. Almost looked like it was touching the moon. The ladder was an impossible thing, standing on its own, seemingly unsupported, but so was this world beneath a world. Overhead, the ceiling sky opened up, allowing the ladder to climb at least 200 feet into the air. The sky itself never broke the illusion that it was real, but if you looked long and hard, you could see the seams where the ceiling widened. But I didn't look long and hard. I looked at the switch. It was planted on the pocked face of the moon, pounded in like a flag left by those developers Dr. Moore had mentioned. It was one of those old-fashioned, industrial lever switches you might see a supervillain throw to kill the power to a metropolis. The mother switch, marriage switch, the thing that would save me from this living, breathing, shifting nightmare. But it was 200 feet above the ground, at the end of a narrow, impossible wooden ladder. I couldn't do this. The rowboat had been hard enough, and with that I had been blinded to the drop, able to willfully ignore the state of its existence. But this, every run, every inch, foot, yard, the view of the forest shrinking away from me, all of them would be an evil, unrelenting reminder that I was high, higher than any human was designed to go, to the stars. So I didn't climb, I didn't move. I folded over, collapsed onto a bed of moss, and sobbed into my bloody palms. Climbing was a means of survival, the only direction in which to escape the crooked thing that rose from the earth. It was bigger than me. It had been submerged in a thin camouflage of soil, like those hunting spiders that bury themselves to catch prey. As soon as I hit the moss, the ground beneath me began to shift, break apart. Silently, it was deadly silent. 4 buried sticks, which had been laying in wait like an axe, drew together as the monster's abdomen rose out of the dirt. Those were its legs, pulling in on its body as it coiled up to pounce. It was bigger than me. That said, no single part of it was wider than my forearm, spare its head, which was narrow and canine, and wrapped in pale, emaciated, hairless skin, but otherwise it was thin, bony, crooked, its clawed legs the same width as its slender abdomen. It was the stick monster of nightmares. It rose on all fours, drawing to its full 10-foot height. Its eyes, blind and useless, like 2 white marble tucked into its skull. It sniffed, and then it howled. It wasn't shrill, it was deep, guttural, ear-splitting, like bones grinding together. Then it lunged. I screamed, scrambled back, forced towards the ladder. I didn't even think. I climbed, fast as I could, not fast enough. One rung after the next, over and up. The ground pulled away. Wham! The stick monster drilled into the bottom of the ladder. The whole thing shook beneath me, but didn't fall. The tip of the ladder must be driven through the moon, I thought, like a stake through a vampire's heart, supported from above, not below. But falling wasn't a problem. I heard scraping, the click of nails. I looked down. The stick monster was scrambling up after me. I was trapped, with nowhere to go but up. My hands were bleeding, filled with splinters. I scrabbled up the ladder as fast as I could, looking up, never down. I was afraid that if I looked down and saw the forest so far below, I would lose all nerve and just seize up, clam together where I was on wait to die. So I didn't look. I moved, fast, hard, climbing like hell. The stick monster was closing in, tearing up after me, its hooked, sloth-like claws shredding the wood, eating through the ladder, and leaving nothing in its wake. There would be no climbing back down. This better work, it had to. One of the rungs snapped in 2, and I fell. I was halfway to the moon switch when the rung snapped. I came down on it, and it split beneath my hands, with a crackle. And just like that, in one misplaced grab, I had lost everything. I was falling. The ladder was pulling away from me, and I realized that meant I was flying backwards. Time slowed down. I saw the night sky, and realized that it was real, not a ceiling at all. How could I have thought it was a ceiling? Or maybe it was, and this was all just another lie. I saw the creature 20 yards beneath me, clawing up the ladder in a cloud of splintered wood. I saw the broken run fall, tumbling, drifting. I saw myself wheeling out over empty air, only my feet on the ladder to keep me grounded, falling backwards, my hands pinwheeling, my lungs struggling for breath, my vision shrinking to a pinprick. My tongue dry, like an old sponge that hasn't seen moisture for decades. I was falling, and I was going to die for real. No, after all I'd been through, my legacy wasn't going to be a red smear on the forest floor, so I forced movement to my hand. It shot out, and for a sickening second grabbed nothing but empty air. Then I felt the next run beneath my fingers, solid wood, splinters cutting up through my skinned palms. But I didn't care. It reminded me that there was something there. I pulled myself in, hugged the ladder for a long while. Then I heard the snarling creature clawing up after me. I looked down, saw it closing in on me, 15 yards behind, bellowing that awful, arid roar. I looked up, could see the moon just ahead, a crescent no bigger than a dining table, simply planted in the starry night sky, glowing with warm, white light. It had looked so much bigger from below. I saw the switch drilled into its surface, waiting for me to throw it. I reached up for the next run when something grabbed my ankle and yanked me back. The stick horror had one clawed hand wrapped around my leg, its snarling, awful jaws snapping up at me. I cried out, no, screamed, anger and pain scraping up through my throat in a raw, powerful scream, so close from the switch that would save me. So close, I didn't think. I screamed and I stomped, bone crunched underfoot. The creature's narrow legs snapped like a matchstick as I booted. Bone split up through its pale flesh. A warm spray of black blood hissed out, splattered me. The creature shrieked. It shook the world. I thought it would shatter the moon. Then the creature faltered, lost its grip, and fell. Its legs paddled for purchase, trying to find a grip on the ladder, but it couldn't, and so it fell. I watched it shrink, watched it disappear through the treetops. Then I turned and climbed, knowing the stick monster was no more. The moon was cold. It gave off no warmth, just that soft, silver light glowing from beneath its skin like a child's nightlight. I was at the end of the ladder and saw that, yes, the ladder was drilled through the moon's surface. I was eye level with the switch, the one that would send me back. I took a deep breath, pulled a big lungful of air. I gripped the switch and flung it up. Flunk. Nothing happened. A little beat of dread grew in my stomach. I reset the switch and threw it again. Flunk. Nothing happened. I reset and won again. Flunk. And again. Flunk. And again. Flunk. And the world shook, slowly at first, a tight vibration feeding up through the rung ladder. But it quickly blew into a full-blown tremor, a seismic apocalypse ripping up through the world beneath Orion Laboratories. Then everything started to crumble, like a sandcastle under gale force winds. The night sky fell apart in great chunks of rubble, raining down as the world beneath me imploded, like a biblical sinkhole had opened up to swallow the above. It looked like a mouth, as if some ancient beast waking from hibernation had decided to feed. The moon broke apart, crumbled like old rock, releasing the ladder embedded in its surface. Releasing me, I fell, plummeted, holding onto the ladder until that disintegrated through my fingers, and I fell with nothing to hold onto but myself. The wind rushed through me, the ground rushed toward me. I watched the sinkhole swallow everything, pulling big islands of forest down into its depths. It was eating them, dissolving everything it swallowed like acid. Then I hit the sinkhole, and dissolved too. I watched my hands crinkle and crumple and rot away, the flesh drying in on itself like a slice of fruit under a dehydrator machine. I could feel the rest of myself wasting off, the little beauty I had rotting to nothing, as the sinkhole sucked the life from my bones. Then the whole world went black, and I felt no more. I came to life in a very white place. Blinding light, hot and stark, was beating down. There were sounds, voices, a name, my name, spoken in unfamiliar mouths. The white withdrew like a curtain pulling back at showtime. A room resolved around me. A laboratory, yes, that's what it was called. People in white coats crowded round. Doctors. No, that wasn't right. I was tucked into the corner of the room, rocking in place, knees cupped to my chest, sobbing into them. I realized I was crying, and wiped tears, and snot on the back of my hand. There was a woman fanning me with my jacket, pulling me off. Amelia, she was saying, "You're back. It's okay. Honey, you're back." "Boo," I started. "Dr. Moore," she said. "I'm Dr. Moore. You're back. We got you back." I looked around and remembered it all. And I was home. I was safe and home. Looking back, I was so naive, so blinded by what I wanted to believe. Little did I know I had left a piece of myself back in that place, or maybe it had installed a piece of itself onto me. Either way, I had no idea, no clue that the real nightmare was only just beginning. I saw my first fracture on the drive home from the nightmare. Fracture, flashes of the nightmare fracturing the real world. If I had listened to the Orion people, maybe I would have been spared. But I don't think so. I think I would have seen things whether I'd stayed behind or not. They had wanted to keep me for a few days, keep a watchful eye on my condition. I told them to screw off. They'd already taken enough from me. I wasn't about to let them have any more of my time. So I took my check and ran. Dr. Moore chased me out into the parking lot, said I'd been through something traumatic and needed friendly faces watching my back. Friendly faces. Laugh riot. Huh? I ignored her, shouldered into my trashy hatchback with mismatched doors and an angry carburetor. She tried to stop me, to get me to listen. I peeled out of there and never looked back. I almost wish I'd stayed. Guess it doesn't matter much now. In the end, life, my ruined, fractured life, led me straight back to the nightmare, straight back into the simulation chamber. Orion Laboratories was buried in the woods just beyond the city, connected to civilization by a winding, two-lane blacktop. The drive was an hour, maybe two, of vast, unending trees. Traffic was sparse, bordering non-existent. Thick woods rolled by outside, a colorful scroll of patchwork greenery. I didn't see any of it. My mind was racing. I wiped sweat. My hands knuckled the wheel, wringing it like it was the neck of my nightmare. And if I could just snap it, everything would be alright. I was thinking back to the things I'd seen, the canyon, and the impossible rowboat, the forest dolls that walked or fell depending on where you looked, the ineffable boxhead who bore those winged spiders. Then I blinked and my world fractured. A shutter click, and I was no longer driving up the forest road. Now I was in a red wasteland, Mars after 500 years of nuclear devastation. Dry and infernal. The sky was a sickly red, gauzed with ash. Twin suns burned through, making the whole thing glow like blood. I was on a cracked asphalt road, a huge, empty lane hemmed by two 50-foot walls of barbed wire. The wire walls were interminable, a coiled, tangled run of rusty razors, sharp enough to cut with a look, stretching as far ahead of me and behind as I could see. Four dangled from the barbs and scraps and tangles, wrenched free of the damned souls that had once tried to scale the deadly walls. This road, the one I drove, was once a footpath that saw an endless caravan of the enslaved driven forth by something ungodly. I don't know how I knew it, but I did. Knew it in the deepest wrinkles of my soul. It took me a while to react, like my thoughts were drenched in a molasses that made them slow to come, and I knew that I was awake now. My mind wasn't trapped in the vulnerable stages of the induced simulation. It felt like if I died out here, I fought that thought away and forced my foot down on the brakes, stomped the pedal to the mat. Only I didn't slow down. I sped up. My car lurched forward, the engine growling as the speedometer rose from 40 to 50 to 60. Then I saw the mountain of bodies, an Everest of limbs, and rotting corpses. Had they been there before? Yes, they must have been. It filled the horizon, taller than a skyscraper, a huge knot of abused bodies, men, women, children blackened with rot, and stacked to the bleeding sky, choking the road in front of me, 100 yards away. No, I hissed, hardly audible over the congested scream of my car. The engine sounded like a sick dog howling at the moon as it was urged faster and faster. I needed to react. I couldn't react. The molasses that had started with my mind now ran down the rest of me, coating me in a sluggish inhibitor, leaving me to watch, eyes wide, skin pale, breath shallow, as I went racing ahead from 60 to 70 to 80. My hands were glued to the wheel, cemented in place. I pried my right hand free and gripped the parking brake, jammed it into position. Nothing happened. My car shot forward, the speedometer rising from 80 to 92. I tried to wrench the wheel to go crashing into the barbed wall instead of that mass of corpses. Somehow that seemed better, more so if I was launched through the windshield and died on impact. I was certain that if I hit the bodies it would avalanche, a million of the fallen dead raining down, collapsing, burying me alive, leaving me to die in moldering darkness. But the wheel was locked, wouldn't budge. The speedometer needle trembled, rounding 90 miles per hour and sweeping towards 100. I couldn't feel the road beneath me anymore. It was a smooth blur whipping by underfoot. My galloping car closed in on the corpses. It was almost like they were moving towards me. 50 yards, 25, so close that I couldn't see the sky above them, so close that I could decipher the faces of the fallen. A woman, rotting flesh drawn back in rictus, a child whose cheeks had slipped away, leaving only a nightmarish smile of moon-white bone, a man missing half his head, a tangle of greenish-black brain dripping out over his face in curly ribbons. My hands were strangling the wheel, gripping it so hard I felt my knuckles burst. Then the corpses came to life. All of them, in some awful, synchronized choir, opened their mouths and honked. It was a deep, throaty trumpet sound that rattled through me, shook the world like an earthquake. I was there. I couldn't stop. My collision course had been cemented, and I clenched my eyes shut as I was about to go drilling into bodies. Then the light changed. I saw it shift behind my eyelids. I opened them and gasped. The world had unfractured, and the angry grill of a long-haul truck filled my windshield. I was on the forest road. I had drifted into the oncoming lane. I was going to die. I screamed. I wrenched the steering wheel. It swung left, sending my car lurching toward trees. For one terrible instant the truck was all I could see, its shadow filling my cab, its snarling grill snapping from my neck. Then I shot off the road. The long-haul truck, whose bed bore the logo of Orion Laboratories, blew past, and then it somersaulted upside down. No, I was upside down. I was weightless. The ground and sky cycled over and up in spasmodic flashes outside my windows. My car spun, flipped, smashed. The windshield bulged, burst, showered me in glass. Blood rushed down my hairline, warm and sticky. I was still going, flying, spinning, free of my binds, unfettered to soar like a bird. I was free. Then my car wrapped around a tree. Glass exploded. I snapped against my seatbelt, bounced my head off my window. I heard a crack like a twig snapping. A light bulb popped behind my eyes. I heard metal scream as my world crashed to black. I awoke in the simulation chamber, strapped down, Dr. Moore looming over me, a devilish smile creasing her pale moon face. I tried to scream and found I couldn't. My mouth was filled with broken teeth and blood. I was choking on it, drowning in it. Amelia, Moore was saying, her voice distant and feverish. Just one more trip, just one more. Then the simulation chamber hissed shut, and I screamed awake for real. I was in my own bed, in my own apartment, and there was someone pounding on the inside of my skull. It must have been my brain. My head was thudding so bad I thought it would explode. I sat up, wincing. Sweat-sodden bedsheets spilled away as I shifted and looked around my tiny studio, pad bound in raw brick and bathed in blue evening light. The room I never thought I'd see again. I expected more nightmare, but I knew this was real, knew that I was awake and home and safe. I also knew, don't ask me how, that my car would be parked down below, unmolested by the accident. I'd no doubt imagined. Fracture. I dry swallowed 2 aspirin, hesitated, chewed down 2 more. The pounding in my head slowly receded like a morning tide, pulling back until my thoughts cleared and my eyes focused. I needed to do something. I wasn't sure what. I parked behind my computer and powered it up. The laptop's screen stung my eyes. I cranked down the brightness and called up Google. Then I researched. First Orion Labs, which I'd done before I'd taken the gig, coming up with nothing indicting, and then pounding in random buzzwords. Fear simulation, fear harvest, fear sickness. After an hour of burrowing down a shallow, unhelpful rabbit hole, I killed the computer, just stared at the wall. Sleep was pulling at me, tugging my eyelids down, making them so very heavy. I fought sleep, terrified of what I might see when it finally came. Then I heard the noise somewhere behind me. Bone crackling, joints popping, something ancient rising from rest. My heart was hammering my ribcage. My breath was intoxicating, cold in my lungs. My apartment was dark, wrapped in shadow, the world outside my windows drenched in night. I didn't dare imagine what might be lurking in those black pockets. The noise had stopped. It was quiet, suffocating, and silent, but I wasn't alone. I could feel eyes drilling into the back of my head. My nape prickled with gooseflesh. My hands tingled. My chest was heavy. My lungs were filled with drying cement. I turned, slowly, quietly, afraid that if my chair squeaked the thing would hear. I turned and my apartment was empty. Bed by the window to my left, kitchenette to my right. Thor just past the kitchenette. Deep pits of shadow claimed the edges of the room, sucked out all the light. I relaxed, exhaled. Then I saw the crooked thing in the corner of the ceiling. A knot of limbs, crooked and jointed, perched like a giant spider on my periphery. My head inched up and over, my eyes finding the ancient woman perched on my ceiling. She looked like she was made of wire hangers, wrapped in wrinkles and leathery skin. Her hair was straw thin and gray as ash, hanging like vines from a lumpy, scabbed scalp. I couldn't see her face. Too many arms and legs sprouted from her narrow, crooked form, all of them jointed and odd, bent in places, and ending in arthritic, claw-like hands, which were planted on the ceiling and holding her in place like a giant spider. She was still, deathly still, like a statue. My terrified heart was beating its fist against my chest, trying to break free of its rib-wrought prison. All I could hear was hot blood roaring through my ears, watching in unbearable dread as the lifeless old woman clung to my ceiling like a rotten insect. She moved so suddenly and abruptly that I screamed. Her limbs pumped and crackled as she skittered across the ceiling to the spot right above me. She stopped, directly overhead, hung there for a moment. I couldn't see her face through her spray of gray hair. Then she dropped like a spider, plummeted down out of the sky, and I saw her face. Oh God, I saw it, and it was wrong. No, it was evil. It was crooked and broken, and wrinkled and wrong, and it was snarling for the hot blood rushing through my neck. I woke up screaming. Morning sunlight was slashing through my cloudy windows. My apartment was empty. Someone was pounding on my front door. I knew who it was even before I forced myself awake and pulled it open. Dr. Moore stood in my apartment hallway, her face flushed, hair a mess, looking harrowed and disturbed. "I'm so sorry," she said. "I'm so sorry, Amelia." I knew what she was going to say before she said it. "You have to go back in." I was in the simulation chamber, and this time it was for real. There's a part of you locked in there, Dr. Moore was repeating. A carbon copy. It was made, trapped, when you were in there past the hour. She looks like you, but she isn't you. She's it. I nodded. She'd given me the same speech on the drive up here. I was resigned, broken, so tired and ruined that I'd do anything to kill the nightmare once and for all. I didn't even argue when she showed up at my place. Just joined her for the hour ride north. You find her, you kill her, we pull you out, Dr. Moore said. They'll know when she's close. You'll sense it. I pulled a deep breath, knowing that her proposal was easier said than done. The apologetic tint in her eyes said that she knew too. Find her and kill her, Dr. Moore told me one last time. Then the simulation chamber sucked shut, and I went tumbling into the nightmare. There's a part of you locked in there, Dr. Moore had said to me just before I was blasted into hell. A carbon copy. It was made, trapped, when you were in there past the hour. She looks like you, but she isn't you. She's it. Find her and kill her. But she had said something else too, something that froze the blood in my veins and my heart mid-pump. You've spent too much time in the simulation already, she continued, far beyond what's acceptable for anyone. If you spend much longer in there. She paused, her face screwing up. You have 15 minutes, Amelia. 15 minutes to find your counterpart and kill her before. But instead of finishing her thought, she pressed an old-fashioned stopwatch into my palm. Then the chamber was hissing shut, and I was spiraling down, barreling through a great black abyss into the unknown, the nightmare waiting for me just beyond, and how it was hard to breathe. God, how it was, and I was dizzy, and sick and screaming, but I couldn't hear it, and then I was in a junkyard, the ticking stopwatch in hand. 14 minutes, and 30 seconds left. I sheathed it in my pocket, and looked around. Moonlight winked off splintered windshields, gleamed off rusted bumpers. Great mountains of cars, some condensed into neat little cubes, others torn and shredded but mostly intact, rose around me in biblical scale, stretching to and fro as far as I could see. It was an endless orchard of Mount Everest, forged from the dead husks of rusted out jalopies and gutted out pickups. It was awesome and otherworldly. It was. Find her and kill her. It was nightmarish and cold. A shiver bit through my bones. Metal creaked and moaned as a sharp wind soaked through the car graveyard. Dirt pathways cut narrow valleys through the range of metal mountains, piles of twisted steel, and broken glass standing out against an icy night sky. Then I heard something, low and tiny, tucked into the hoot of wind. It was a scraping, clicking noise, like nails, so many tiny nails, playing over metal. Then the squeaking came, low at first, building into a mass cacophony, frenzied and skin-crawling, of rodents chittering in psycho chorus. It sounded like a flash flood of rats cascaded out of the ruined cars, squeezing and forcing their way out into the open. There were thousands of them, tens of thousands, a flowing river of squeaking, wriggling fur, their tails pink and awful, their teeth sharp and rabid. They drew out into the pathway and surged toward me, so many of them that it forced the appearance of a great rush of liquid fur, pouring forward to devour me bite for bite. My heart froze, and then unfroze with two rapid crash thuds. My lungs squeezed tight, my legs crawled with disgusting goose flesh. Their smell was suffocating. The reek of fur, damp and ripe, seemed to fill my lungs and choke out all the air. I felt my stomach screw into a knot. Something warm ran down my leg, a trickle of piss. I'd lost my bladder. My mind galloped back to the time that I was 8 and had awoken to a warm bundle tucked over my throat. A giant, attic-bound rat had slithered out of its dark home and taken bed on my tender, delicate neck. Ever since, no, I had to move. The rats were closing in, more joining the flood every second, pouring out on either side of me, leaping and bouncing forward, their tight lips drawn over bone-white teeth that were needle-sharp and ready to bite. I sucked air. My heart crashed through my ribs. I forced life into my bones. I turned and ran like hell. I ran, but the rat river ran faster. A blur of warped and twisted metal zipped by. Rats squeezed out of blown-out headlights, and exhaust pipes gnawed through deflated tires and exposed upholstery, all of them joining the raging flash flood that was roaring after me. Up ahead, my dirt path met a T-junction, hitting a mountain of cars and splitting off to the left and right. Then, wham, a wall of rats came seething in from either side, filling out into an apocalyptic tsunami of hateful, furry forms. They rode each other in waves, boiling forward in a cloud of awful chitters. I was trapped, the rat river rushing in from both ends, burning through the path, and leaving me nothing spare the dirt in which I stood. I spun, searching for a way out, my heart racing, pounding, lungs aching, the air thick with rodent reek, mountains of cars blocking me in, a flood of rats crashing closer. I was filled with a tight elemental terror, like a white-hot poker had been jammed through my stomach and left there to sizzle. My throat crawled as I watched the mass of scampering rodents seethe in on me, filling my view. Then a flash of faded orange snapped by on my periphery, a color I knew like my first kiss. I planted my feet and lunged. That color, a sun-bleached cross between pumpkin and beige, belonged to the trunk of my first car, an old hatchback with mismatched doors and duct-taped seats. And it was my car, not just a doppelganger. A peeling bumper sticker I knew all too well stood out against the smog-blasted bumper. I grabbed the latch, felt it click beneath my fingers, and flung the trunk wide, just as the rat river collided behind me. And then I was engulfed in a living ball of squirming, hot fur. They clawed through my hair, probed their hot snouts up my ears, writhed through my arms and legs. They scrabbled up at me, needling at my legs with their dreadful carved teeth. Blinding flashes of pain sang up my thighs as the massive rats tore scraps of warm flesh from my bones. I screamed and forced myself into the trunk space, kicking and pounding at the creatures starving for my living flesh. I fought most of them free, stomping and crushing their glassy bones, crunching them dead as I negotiated my body, which seemed too heavy and not like my own, into the trunk. I pressed myself down and slammed the lid shut, sealing out the scraping, clicking nails of the great rat river. It was a roar of squeaks and clicks, deafening in the claustrophobic trunk. But I didn't have time to despair. My legs were screaming. A warm puddle of blood was collecting in the trunk beneath me. I could feel my legs being worked, gnawed, as two tenacious rodents ate their fill. I pawed blindly and felt a warm pouch of fur on my leg. With a cry of disgust, I wrenched it up and squeezed until bone popped beneath my fingers, and the blood-soaked rat fell limply away. I felt for the second, desperate to be free of it. It chittered and snapped at my hand. A flash of pain bolted up my arm. I screamed and kicked at the thing, trapping it beneath my shoe and the wall. I felt its anatomy crackle, crunching down into a loose ball of flesh as it squealed and writhed. I pressed harder, grinding the ball of my foot against the awful rodent until I felt it burst and send a hot rush of expended guts running down my right leg. The awful, slimy goop collected in my pants, my shoes, soaking my socks with rat blood. I gagged and fought back a spray of vomit which came up anyway, splattering the trunk and filling it with the sour reek of sick. I shuddered, spit, wiped my mouth, maneuvered my body, and kicked forward the backseat of my first car. My car wasn't trapped beneath a mountain of steel and rubber, it was in a tunnel. Fenders and headlights and wheels and trunks textured the darkness around me as if the narrow, one-lane pass was burrowed through the endless sea of junk vehicles. At the end of the tunnel stood a strange collage of light. It almost looked like a circus, and as my eyes adjusted, I saw it was a circus, warm and inviting, lulling me with faint calliope music and the smell of peanuts and popcorn. I reached for the ignition, no doubt in my mind that my hand would find the key. It did. My old car growled to life, humming beneath me, ready to roll. I eased my foot on the gas. Metal scraped and clawed at my hatchback as I withdrew from the crowd of cars stacked above and around me. They collapsed down with a tremendous report, filling out the gaps as I pulled out and off, trundling up the tunnel, headed for the circus. I stood in the empty circus with 5 minutes to go. It was endless, I mean literally endless. Striped tents and carny carriages stretched as far in every direction as I could see across an infinite grassy plain. It was abandoned, the lights still flashing, and the smell of fried dough still warm and sweet in the air, as if only moments before the attendees and performers had just vanished. I felt eyes crawling over my skin and turned. I saw no one. Feeling vulnerable, I started walking briskly, my head roving, eyes scanning the tents. My car had died as I exited the tunnel. The engine gave a long, mournful sigh and then ground to a stop, forcing me to continue on foot. 4 minutes. I looked at the stopwatch, ticking down, burning away the little time I had left. And what happened if the time ran out? I didn't know and didn't want to find out. So I continued on, hurrying, scanning, not sure where I was supposed to go. I felt lost and dizzy, surrounded by that endless circus which reminded me so much of an infinity mirror. 3 minutes. I stared at the stopwatch. How is that possible? Just a second ago it had been at 4. Without thinking, I started to run, my feet sinking through grass and pounding me up identical rows of tents and rides, all of them painted with garish colors that spoke of clowns and strongmen and acrobats and magicians. I ran harder, the wind yanking at me, burning my eyes until they bled salt. 2 minutes. I stopped, turned, spun, lost and confused, shipwrecked in an ocean of tents. And then I saw it and jerked to a stop, hauling air through my bruised chest, staring at the haunted house on the hill, knowing that was where I was supposed to go. The midway curved suddenly up, swelling into a low hill that bore a crooked manor, dark and ugly in its disrepair, lifeless, and yet pulsing with something beyond life. It was 2 stories and gray, so gray, like its timber was sick, and its cloudy windows, which looked to me like so many eyes, were sick too. I didn't want to go into that place, wander its tenebrous halls and shadow-soaked staircases. It was a house for which haunted houses were named, but I didn't have time. The stopwatch was ticking away, swallowing up the little time I had left with each stutter of the second hand. Without thinking, I fell into a run. The tents shifted into a blur of color as I ground up the hill, my legs aching and bleeding, my brain ratcheting through my skull, expanding and ballooning until the whole world was warped and blurred. I staggered up the porch which creaked underfoot, brushed away a sheet of cobweb, gripped the great brass door handle, and pushed into the buttery warmth of an 18th century masquerade ball. Dozens of masked guests, men in tuxedos and women in luxurious gowns, moved in silent tandem, sweeping through the Baroque candlelit space to the music in their heads. It was deadly silent, spare the shuffle of feet, a sound like insects crawling through a hive, so pointedly wrong that it made my skin crawl. A great carpeted staircase swooped up from the far end of the room, feeding up into the darkened second floor. I knew that was where I was meant to go. 1 minute. I started through the sea of people, made it a quarter of the way through before a man gripped my hands and pulled me into a step and shift dance. His mask was fashioned of gore, lumps of human skin crudely stitched together into the infamous drama mask, a drooping frown forced into the folds, 2 teardrop-shaped eye holes framing shadow. I gasped and jerked free and continued fighting through the mess of bodies, all dancing, shuffling, their masks growing progressively worse. Some of them blank and glassy and plainly horrific, others leaving me unsure if they were masks at all. 50 seconds. The crowd thickened. As I drew deeper, a suffocating crush of bodies, suddenly sweeping me in like a riptide and pulling me back away from the stairs. I struggled but was only pulled further, caught in this moving mess of human quicksand, trapped between a half-dozen gowns and tuxedos, masks flashing by, horrific grins, and manic eyes. An elbow caught me in the ribs, folded me in half. Another came in and barked off my forehead. I was jostled, manhandled, bounced around. All I could do was scream. As soon as I did, the candles on the chandelier doused in a puff of smoke, and the room erupted into silence, a deep, suffocating silence. I was alone. The dancers were gone and I was alone. I stood up, the ticking watch in hand, and saw that the room had transformed into a rotten mess of scabbed wallpaper and cobweb furnishings, everything filmed in an inch of dust. It had transformed into a haunted house. I found my counterpart in the laboratory with 15 seconds to go. It looked like a mad scientist's crazy cave, tables of complicated inventions, all wires and levers, lined tables under the guttering light of gas lanterns. Amelia was there. I was there, wearing a hospital slip. Find her and kill her. She, me, was shackled to an operating table, bound and gagged, thrashing in her binds. When she saw me, her eyes went wide and bright with terror. She struggled against her fetters, wrenching her arms and legs to no avail. 10 seconds. I moved beside her, stood over her. She was trying to speak through the ball gag jammed down her throat like an apple in the mouth of a Christmas pig. Muted syllables came out. Nothing I could decipher. I couldn't do this. I looked away. 5 seconds. Dr. Moore's voice echoed through my head. Find her. I saw a rusty scalpel on a nearby table, tucked between a robotic homunculus and the blueprints for a Da Vinci-esque flying machine. And kill her. I grabbed the scalpel without thinking. 3 seconds. Raised the weapon over my facsimile, my hands shaking. Heard thudding. Tears salting my cheeks. 2 seconds. She stared up at me, pleading with her eyes, desperately shaking her head, trying to speak through her gags. Myself. 1 second. I jammed the scalpel through the other Amelia's chest. It disappeared through fabric and skin, crunching through bone as it pierced her warm, pounding heart. She screamed through her gag, her face nodding with agony, a thin flower of blood blooming through her hospital gown. Then she began to waste away, her skin wrinkling, drying, sucking down against her bones as it lost its moisture, leaving her nothing but dust in the empty white slip. I was crying, sobbing, my hands holding the bloody scalpel. The stopwatch was beeping, screaming in my ear, and then I felt pain, a dull throbbing in my chest, low at first, building into a white-hot flare of agony that flooded my ribcage like molten lava. Did you really think it'd be that easy? The voice behind me chuckled. I tried to turn, but I couldn't. I was covered in glue, and my clothes were wet, my shirt sticky and warm. I looked down. My hands were gripping the scalpel I'd jammed through my chest. The world split in two, and I fell forward, taking a few of the tabletop inventions with me as I grappled for leverage. I thudded to the floor, cracking my head off nicotine-stained linoleum. Blood pooled beneath me, and in its black reflection I saw myself, standing above me, the other me, the one I was supposed to kill, but couldn't, smiling, laughing, her eyes gleaming with heinous amusement. I tried to speak, but my mouth was filled with hot copper. I coughed blood as a warm, safe darkness rippled in on the edges of my vision, swallowing my view to a pinprick. She was howling laughter, a sound that was mine, and not mine at all. Then the world went black. Then the world went white. A blinding, searing white burned my eyes as the simulation chamber pulled open, and I awoke from the nightmare once and for all. I groped my way out, collapsed to the floor, put a hand on the belly of the chamber to steady myself, and when I took it away there was a smear of blood. I looked down at myself. I was soaked in blood, drenched in it, gowned in it, the scalpel sticking from my chest. It's okay, Amelia, Dr. Moore said. I'll fix you right up. I looked up, slowly, from her reserved slacks to that starched lab coat, then up to her head, which was not a head at all but a box, a rusty, perforated box like that impossible thing I'd seen on the first trip. Fix you right up. Then she hissed, and a cloud of spiders exploded from out of the box, filling the laboratory, and despite the hot agony I felt all over, I screamed. I screamed until my mouth filled with spiders, and they flooded my lungs, and I screamed no more. And when I was pulled out of the nightmare, for real, I was covered not with blood, but sweat, that skin-tight seal suit clinging to me like a disease. I was surrounded by an army of lab coats. They parted like the white sea as Dr. Moore forced her way through. I didn't kill her, was all I could croak. Dr. Moore looked at me, alarmed, slightly confused. Kill who? She asked. I looked up at the clock. It was 2:59. It was the day before, and I'd only been in the chamber for less than an hour. I've been chain smoking in the Orion Labs parking lot. While I dictate my story, it's all I can do to try and make sense of my story. My world is broken, fractured. They told me that it was all part of the simulation, that I was never pulled out, that there was no malfunction. I'm not sure I believe them. Find her and kill her. I'm tired. My bones feel brittle under skin. That's much too tight. I've seen things already, shadows that move on the corners of my eyes, shapes that blur by and disappear. When I turn to look, I can't help but wonder if I'm still in the chamber. And the real me, my body, is locked on the outside in an induced state of rest, asleep in a cylinder somewhere far away, while my mind is left to scream. I don't know anymore. I just don't know. I don't think I can do this, my wife grunted through clenched teeth. You've got this, I said, squeezing her hand. Just push. And she heaved, obliterating my fingers in her vice grip. Oh, I mean, you're doing great, Luna. I think I can see him crowning. After one final exertion, Luna collapsed, her labored breaths heavy and fatigued. You did it, honey. I'm so proud of you, I said, grinning from ear to ear at my sweat-soaked wife. That smile quickly faded when the doctor's words met my ears. Oh my God. My heart began to beat a mile a minute. I slowly shuffled toward the edge of the bed, my elation devolving into a growing sense of dread. What I saw still sends shivers down my spine to this day. The doctor had my son cradled in his grasp. The baby was deathly silent. He didn't utter so much as a whimper. Babies are supposed to cry when they're born, right? But what chilled me to my core wasn't the newborn's silence. It was his skin. My son, still soaked in blood, was dark purple, like his tiny body had been crushed under a hydraulic press. And those eyes, those predatory, hungry orbs glowed a sickly yellow. Luna gazed wide-eyed at our child. Her face went ghostly white, and she stifled a scream. What's wrong with him? She choked out. I don't know. I've never seen anything like it. We're going to have to get him to the NICU right away. The doctor rushed out of the room with the baby firmly gripped in his arms. My veins turned to ice as the child's cold, unwavering stare bore into my chest. Zane, I'm scared. What if they can't save him? Luna sobbed, fat tears staining her hospital gown. I brushed a stray hair from her forehead and locked eyes with her. Everything is going to be okay. Jack is going to be okay. She sniffled, her ocean blue irises shimmering with hope. I like that name. Jack it is. They waited on pins and needles for word from the medical staff. I thought I caught one of the nurses glaring at Luna a couple times as she rushed past. She didn't seriously think that my wife had something to do with Jack's appearance, did she? They waited in that drab, strange-smelling room for what felt like an eternity. I must have nodded off at some point because I was jolted awake by Luna relentlessly patting my arm. Zane, wake up. I was just resting my eyes. Whatever, the doctor's here. I immediately straightened up in my chair, a simultaneous mixture of apprehension and excitement bubbling within me. The doctor scowled at me before turning to my wife. The baby is going to be okay. Luna and I breathed a collective sigh of relief. Hearing those words felt like an anvil was lifted off my chest. Oh, thank goodness. You don't know how happy it makes me to hear that, Luna said, grinning harder than the Cheshire cat. Don't get me wrong, I was elated, but all the while, something gnawed at me. A vile, disgusting feeling that I couldn't put my finger on. What was wrong with him? I mean, why did he look like that? I asked, sensing the tension in the room returning. It was heavy, oppressive, and I didn't like it one bit. The doctor looked me directly in the eyes. His tone was light, but I could make out something else swimming just beneath his features. Thea, honestly, we don't know. He looks normal. His complexion returned to its original pigmentation a few minutes after he arrived in the NICU. I don't know what to make of it. That's great news, isn't it, Zane? I was so worried. Does that mean we can leave today? I felt a smile tugging at the corners of my lips. Luna's enthusiasm was contagious. Well, with your permission, we'd like to monitor the baby's health for about a week or so, just to be certain that his condition is stable. As for you, we recommend staying at least 2 days before being discharged. Oh, I guess that's okay. Jack's health is our main concern. Right, honey? Right, I said, rubbing the back of my neck. I'll have the nurse prepare to discharge you in a couple days. For now, just get some rest. Luna slumped down into her bed as the doctor directed his attention to me. Mr. Fowler, can I have a word with you? I nodded, following him into the hall. Once we were out of Luna's earshot, the doctor's expression shifted to one of stern trepidation. Look, there's no professional way to put this, so I'm just going to come out and say it. I think something is very wrong with your son, Mr. Fowler, and I'm not talking about his health. I know you've seen the way he looks at people, how he stares through them. He shuddered at the mere mention of it. A chill crawled up my own spine at the thought. I don't know if it's even legal for me to recommend this, but I highly suggest getting in contact with a priest. There's something not right about that boy. I mulled over his words. My heart dropped. My intuition was right. It seemed like there really was something wrong with Jack. All I could do was nod in response. I returned to Luna, as if nothing had happened. What'd the doctor say? Nothing, really. He just had a few questions about our billing information. She pursed her lips, pondering my statement. She seemed skeptical, but she didn't call my bluff. I sank into the chair beside my wife's bed and prepared for an exhausting week. A handful of agonizing days later, we returned to the hospital to welcome our little bundle of joy into our home. He was fast asleep when the nurse handed him to Luna. He's been sleeping a lot, but that's normal for newborns. Best of luck to you both, the nurse whispered, smiling warmly at my wife. My heart swelled looking at the baby nestled in Luna's arms. His rosy cherub cheeks, blonde wispy curls, and the soft coos that escaped his lips when he exhaled all worked to activate a proud, protective instinct from deep within me. I finally understood what parents meant by their pride and joy. Thank you. We really do appreciate all your help, I said. I was met with a cold stare as the nurse returned to her station. Okay, let's get out of here. I'm itching to get Jack home. We strapped Jack into his new car seat and we were off. The hospital was only about a 20-minute drive from our home. It should have been a smooth ride. Around 10 minutes in, I glanced in the rearview mirror. I was met with a pair of yellow radiating eyes glaring back at me. I was entranced by them. My mind immediately shot back to the day Jack was born. That unfaltering, icy glare exuded an aura of pure malice. My heart thumped like a jackhammer in my chest, and sweat began to pool above my brow. I didn't know it was possible for a baby to instill such a strong feeling of dread. Saying, "The road." I was snapped back to reality by Luna's terrified shriek. I swerved just in time, narrowly avoiding a collision with the semi-truck in the opposite lane. What is going on with you? You nearly got us killed. Do you need me to drive? Sorry, feeling kind of lightheaded. You know, nerves and stuff. I think I'm going to take you up on that offer. Actually, Luna took the wheel for the remainder of the drive, while I cowered in the passenger seat, desperate to escape Jack's insidious gaze. I should have taken the doctor's words more seriously. There really was something wrong with my son. Once we arrived home, Luna carried Jack inside, while I dipped into our bedroom to gather my thoughts. I wasn't really being coerced by a baby, was I? Surely not. With my pride in check, I returned to my family. I gazed lovingly at the pair as my wife cooed over our unresponsive child. Luna seemed to be enjoying Jack's first day home, so I didn't want to spoil the fun by bringing up his cryptic behavior. But as it turned out, I wouldn't have to. Luna and I slumped into bed. We just tucked Jack into his crib, and we were beat. Though Jack hadn't uttered a peep, the mental strain was already beginning to take a toll. I activated the baby cam that I'd synchronized with my phone as Luna flipped through Netflix series on the TV. She landed on some cheesy rom-com. Gross, just what I want to see after a long, taxing day. We sat in silence, reflecting on the events of the evening, until Luna turned down the volume and faced me. Tears threatened to spill down her cheeks, and her bottom lip began to quiver, saying, "What's wrong with our baby? What do you mean? Aren't babies supposed to make noise and giggle and grab things? I haven't seen Jack move a single muscle. What if he can't move? What if he's suffering? I'm so scared." My heart shattered seeing her like that. Luna had baby fever since the moment we tied the knot, and now that she finally had one, he was completely lethargic. "Hey, look at me. Everything is going to be okay. I'm sure he's just getting his bearings after being trapped in here for 9 months." I playfully lifted Luna's shirt and blew a wet raspberry into her belly. She couldn't help but laugh, her boisterous giggles mending my spirits. "If we still don't have a breakthrough in a week or so, we can take him to a specialist. Sound good?" She timidly nodded, scooting close to me and nestling her head into my chest. "I'm so glad I have you to help me through this. You're going to be a great father. I love you, Zane. And you're going to be an incredible mom. I love you too, Luna." My eyes creaked open to a barrage of notifications. Ding, ding, ding. I snatched up my phone, rushing to silence it before it woke Luna. My heart dropped. All of the notifications were from the baby cam, and they all said the same thing: motion detected. Dread crashed over me like a tidal wave. Jack hadn't moved all day, so what was setting off the camera? I furiously punched in my passcode and opened the app connected to the camera. What I saw still gives me goosebumps. Once the app loaded, I was met with Jack's stoic face. I was so startled that I nearly dropped my phone. He was standing in his crib, dementedly glowering at the camera. That shouldn't be possible. He shouldn't have hit that milestone for at least another 9 months. I could feel Jack's depraved frown burning into my psyche. Those luminescent yellow eyes locked with mine, It was like he could see me watching him. I reluctantly slipped from bed, though every synapse in my brain screamed at me not to. I needed to go check it out. I slowly crept across the hall to Jack's room. I pushed the door open, trying my best to avoid alerting him to my presence. My efforts were fruitless. Jack's eyes landed on me the moment I entered the room. His hateful glare sent a shiver rippling through my body. He raised a chubby arm and pointed directly toward the door. I hated to admit it, but at that moment, I was terrified of my own son. Fear coursed through my veins like venom. My eyes grew wide as I backed out of the room, because just for a second, I swear I could see a flash of red dance across Jack's pupils. I was trembling when I returned to bed. What the hell was that? Without a word, my week-old infant had commanded me to go back to my room, and I was powerless to resist. I somehow managed to fall into a fitful slumber not too long afterward. It all felt like some kind of wild fever dream. I really wished that was the case. I awoke the next day to an empty bed. Luna always did enjoy mornings. Me, not so much. I groggily rubbed my eyes as I slunk to the kitchen. "Good morning, sleepyhead," Luna giggled. "Morning. What's wrong, honey? You look like you got hit by a train." "Gee, thanks. I didn't sleep well." "It's nothing." Jack's still sleeping, like a rock. "Good. I think I'm going to head to the store. We're running low on milk." "Oh, I guess we are. Just make sure to come back," she said, shooting me a wink. "Don't worry, you're stuck with me." "But you already knew that," I said, planting a kiss on her cheek. I threw on my flip-flops and headed out. I exhaled sharply as I sank into the driver's seat. The milk was just an excuse. Truth be told, I just wanted a few minutes away from Jack. I was still processing the events from the night prior. I mean, anyone would need to step away after that, right? I was scanning expiration dates on the half gallons of 2% when I felt it. A sudden, overwhelming sense of doom stabbed me like a knife to the gut. I couldn't explain it. Hell, I still can't. But whatever it was, it told me that something sinister was going on. I needed to get home, and fast. I bolted out of the store like a man possessed. I could feel dozens of prying eyes following me as I sprinted through the automatic doors. I never should have left them alone. I slammed the car into drive and floored it, flying down the streets at an alarming speed. I whipped into the driveway and threw the car in park. My heart threatened to leap from my chest as I burst through the door, desperate just to hear my wife's voice. "Luna, Luna, where are you?" Silence. I darted into the kitchen and froze. Jack was sitting in his high chair, but he wasn't scowling at me like he normally would. No, for the first time since he was born, Jack was smiling, and that scared me even more. I tentatively approached him. The smirk pasted on his round face filled me with horror, and then I noticed it. Jack was gnawing on something. It took way more effort than I'd like to admit, but eventually, I was able to pry the mystery object from his iron grip. When I laid eyes on it, I painted the linoleum with the previous night's dinner, because the object that my baby had been sucking on was a severed human finger. I've been a barber for almost 15 years now. My grandpa was a barber, and my fondest memories of him were eating candy in one of his chairs while listening to him shoot the shit with locals. "Johnny, I don't just cut hair," he would say. "I'm also a therapist, a lawyer, a political advisor, and a professional secret keeper. And every once in a while," he said while taking out a bottle of hair dye, "I can temporarily reverse the effects of time." That's what I liked most about my grandpa. People trusted him. They would plop themselves down in his chair and prattle on about anything. I learned about politics, sports, gossip, and even how the mayor of our small town kept his hair jet black. Cutting hair was all I wanted to do, so when he passed, I decided to take over his little shop and carry on the traditions. My family was shocked, as I had previously worked at a high-end, prestigious salon in Los Angeles at the time. But deep down, I'm a sentimental sap. You can't put a price on some things. Most of my grandpa's clientele switched to me, and I just picked up where he left off. I didn't change a thing. I kept the faded black and white tile and the worn barber's chair, not wanting to disrupt the comfort of my customers. It was all about the client, after all, and I cherished every experience with them, except for one, Dwayne Corliss. My grandpa grew up with Dwayne and cut his hair about once a month, which was odd because even back then, He was mostly bald. Even more strange is that my charismatic grandpa didn't say a word to Dwayne while cutting his hair. In fact, he seemed to be uncomfortable while doing it. Dwayne would pay my grandpa in cash and then saunter out of the shop. He always was an oddball. My grandpa said one day while I was sweeping up clumped hair off the floor, "He's got a son around your Uncle Nate's age, but I hardly ever see him." I didn't even expect Dwayne Corliss to still be alive, but one fall afternoon, I heard the door chime from the office, and there he was, staring off into space with a slack-jawed gaze. He may have still been breathing, but he was tiny, frail, and looked like he just came out of a bad cold. A few white wisps of hair still clung to his head. "Don Jenkins at the Brookshires told me you took over the place," he muttered softly. "I'd like a haircut, please." I led Dwayne to the chair and fastened the cutting cape around his wrinkly, wiry neck. He stared at himself in the mirror the whole time, with a grimace on his face. I don't recall him ever blinking. He only moved to signal that he was okay with the job. The whole cut lasted less than 5 minutes. Dwayne handed me a crumpled $10 bill and then shifted toward the door. "Maybe I'll see you next month," he mumbled before shuffling outside. I almost felt bad for Dwayne, but pushed the thought out of my mind in time for my next customer. I inquired about how he was doing with Steve Robinson, a lawyer who knew just about everyone in town. Dwayne stopped by. Steve began. "Yeah, he's been having some health problems. I think his son moved back in with him a while back." "Oh yeah, Grandpa mentioned he had a son. What's he like?" "Yeah, David's his name. He's nice enough, I guess. I remember he was at the community college with my daughter Janine back in the 90s. Then he left town. Dwayne said he got a new job or something. Is he working?" "Not sure. He's in and out of town a lot, so maybe." I shrugged my shoulders and finished fixing up Steve. A couple weeks rolled, and I forgot about Dwayne Corliss until he returned to the shop precisely 1 month since I last saw him. This time, I was determined to engage him and reconcile with my grandfather's previous awkwardness. "Well, hi, Mr. Corliss. You want the usual?" Dwayne smiled softly and sat in the chair. I tried to make conversation and got a couple of words out of him. He was hardly the pariah other folks made him out to be. I began to feel even more guilty, but decided to make amends and give Dwayne the best experience possible. He didn't talk much, but I could tell he enjoyed being spoken to. I cut Dwayne's hair for the next 5 months, until one day, he came in looking more sickly than ever. I asked if he was doing okay, but he waved off my concerns. "I want you to cut it all off this time," he croaked. "I think I want to try being bald for a change." It took me less than a minute to shear off the last bits of stubborn white hair that Dwayne kept. He rubbed his almost mummified fingers over his naked head and smiled. "Thanks, Johnny. This looks great." I could feel tears welling inside my eyes, somehow knowing this would be the last time I'd see him. Dwayne handed me a $10 bill and walked to the door. Before he would leave, Dwayne would always softly say, "See you next month." But this time, he just waved goodbye. 2 weeks later, I got a call from Steve Robinson. "Hey, Johnny, wanted to call to tell you that Dwayne Corliss passed away. There won't be a service, but I thought you should know." "Damn," I replied. "He was a good guy, great customer too. I think we may have even become friends." Steve cleared his throat. "See, well, that's not exactly what I'm calling about, Johnny. You know, I'm just about everyone's lawyer in this town. I did Dwayne's will, and well, he left you a good chunk of change." I flew to Steve's office in my truck, my mind racing. What in the hell was going on? I hardly knew Dwayne. Why on earth would he leave me something in his will? Steve noticed my confusion when I entered his office and poured me a hefty glass of bourbon before reading Dwayne's will. A man I hardly knew left me $25,000. I gulped down the whiskey, hoping it would calm my nerves, but I could still feel my hands shaking under Steve's desk. "There's one thing I need to show you, though," Steve began, and I could sense some discomfort in his voice. He handed me a letter that was scrawled in shaky handwriting. "Dear Johnny, I wanted to thank you and Nelson for taking care of me all these years. Since Nelson is gone, I want to leave this gift for you. Hopefully, you can spruce up the shop. My only ask is that you cut my son Davy's hair too. It's always so messy. D.W. Corliss. You get the money either way." This was a suggestion, not a condition. Steve finally spoke after a minute of awkward silence. That something tells me that David needs someone to talk to like his daddy did. Plus, well, I'm not supposed to be telling you this, but Dwayne didn't leave much for his son, not even close to what he left you in the church. The pit in my stomach turned again, and a pang of sadness washed over me. I nodded, and Steve wrote down the address to Dwayne's house. David should still be there, though I'm not sure if he's in town. I think I have his number somewhere. I floated back to the shop and sat aimlessly in the barber's chair, still taking in everything. I placed a call to the number Steve gave me, but it went straight to voicemail. I left a message for David expressing my condolences and eagerness to cut his hair. The following afternoon, I heard the bell chime and the shuffling of feet. I walked around the corner and saw a short, scrawny man looking through a magazine in the waiting area. As I approached him, I realized it was David. He looked just like Dwayne, small and razor thin with beady, blue eyes. But unlike his father, David had a head full of thick, sandy blonde hair, albeit a little faded for his age. I extended my hand. "He must be David. Please, call me Davy," he replied, shaking my hand weakly. His voice was soft and meek like his father's. Davy examined me, and I felt his eyes drifting toward my hair, growing wide in excitement. "Dad said you were the best at cutting hair. Can you make mine look like yours?" I laughed, genuinely enjoying the compliment. "I can make your hair look even better." Davy grinned and hurried over to my chair. Davy wasn't as chatty as some of my other customers, but he certainly talked more than his father. He spent a lot of time traveling for work as a truck driver, but he liked the long hours on the road. We chatted briefly about current events when Davy asked if I had a girlfriend. I told him I did, and he seemed to be slightly disappointed. "I'm still looking for the right gal," he said quietly, hoping a new look will help with that. I snipped the top of Davy's hair and was almost surprised at how unhealthy it looked. It felt brittle to the touch, and even his scalp looked splotchier than the rest of his head. After I finished his cut, I pulled out a bottle of conditioner I kept in the back. "The men in this town are always too concerned about how manly they are," I said while handing Davy the conditioner. "But I promise your hair will look healthier if you shower with this." Davy's eyes lit up. "Well, I can't believe how great I look now. Can't wait to try this out." I told Davy his haircuts would be on the house in memory of his father. He shook my hand in gratitude and then bolted out of the shop. A couple months went by before he came in for another cut. "Hey, Johnny, that conditioner sure did help," Davy exclaimed when he came back into the store. His hair looked even longer than when he previously showed up at my shop. It looked thicker and had a deeper, more vibrant golden blonde color. I smiled and began to cut his hair, chatting with Davy about what was new with him. But I kept getting distracted by how great his hair looked. It looked more textured and felt silky smooth to the touch. It seemed to shimmer even under the dull box light that had been in the shop since the 1970s. Maybe I needed to get back on the conditioner. "Davy, I cannot believe how great your hair looks, especially since your dad was balder than a baby. No offense, of course, none taken." Davy chuckled. "They say the baldness comes from your mom's side, after all, but it hasn't looked this good since when I was a kid." I finished the cut and told Davy I would order some matching shampoo for the conditioner. He could pick it up at the store once it came in. It came a couple days later, but Davy's number went straight to voicemail again. When I called him, I knew his address, so I just figured I'd drive over and leave it in his mailbox. But the Corliss household didn't have one, so I drove up the gravel road to place the package on his front porch. The door was slightly ajar, and I called out for Davy, but was greeted by silence. I left the package on the floor and then turned back to my truck when I heard a soft noise coming from inside. I don't know how to explain it. It was a thumping noise, like a box falling off a counter and onto the floor. I peeked in to see what the commotion was, but the living room was pitch black. I fumbled on the wall beside me for a switch, found one, and turned on the light. I stepped into the house, sinking into the old carpet on the floor. The outdated wood panel walls were littered with family photos, and I stopped to look at them. The first few were of a young Dwayne and a pretty woman with long blonde hair, who I suspected to be Davy's mom. I found it funny that neither of them ever talked about her. The next couple of photos depicted Davy from when he was a baby to a young man, beaming happily in all of them. His blonde hair was always shaggy, and even in the sepia-colored photos, looked magnificent. I followed the frames chronologically until I stopped at a picture of Davy and Dwayne at what looked like his high school graduation. The woman was missing from the photo, and Davy and his father looked somber instead of smiling. Davy was holding his graduation cap in his hands, and I was a little confused when I glanced at the top of his head. Like his father, he was already beginning to bald. I heard the thumping noise again, but this time it sounded even louder. Curious, I followed the noise to a room at the end of the hallway. I knocked on the door and called out Davy's name but didn't get a response. "This is crazy," I muttered under my breath, but before I could turn around, I heard the thump again. I'm not sure what washed over me, but every time I heard that damn noise, I felt like something was off. I opened the door and almost let out a yelp. Under the bedroom's only window was a long dresser that almost scraped the entryway to the bathroom. On top of the dresser were 5 decaying mannequin heads. Each head was wearing a wig. I tiptoed to the dresser and studied the wigs. They were all blonde and shorter except for the first wig, which looked ancient. That one was maybe shoulder length. Despite their disheveled appearance, these wigs looked well made and expensive. I doubt they were crafted from synthetic hair. The wig at the end looked similar to Davy's hair when he first came to my shop, and I saw the cuts I made with my scissors on the top. Why was Davy having me cut his wigs? Did he want to make the facade look as real as possible? I heard the thump again, deducing that it came from the bathroom. It sounded different though, wet and sloshy, like someone was trying to get out of a bathtub. I crept to the bathroom and peered around the side, and inside the tub was a tied-up man. The top of his head was scalped. The man turned to look at me. His eyes grew wide, and he started screaming from the duct tape under his mouth. Blood squirted from the gaping wound, and his eyes rolled into the back of his head. I frantically called 911 and placed a towel over the man to stop the bleeding. When Davy returned home not 10 minutes later, he was greeted by the entire police department. I remember seeing him sheepishly hold his hands up in the front seat of his car as he was swarmed by armed officers. We made eye contact as he was being hauled away. I made it look real, didn't I, Johnny? The new police chief, Don Henderson, another of my customers, called me a few days later with some details. The state police came in and found 5 people's bodies underneath the Corliss household's floorboards. One of those bodies was Davy's mother, who had unknowingly been removed from her resting place in the county cemetery. Dwayne Corliss made several calls to the police over the years, but gave up after they never looked into his concerns. Each victim was a man who had blonde hair. Davy confessed to the murders, but Chief Henderson thinks the state police will connect him to at least 10 more. They also found a journal in which Davy laments his hair loss and believes it was why he could never find love. I read the journal in a PDF file, and he spends half of the book blaming his mother. He talks about seeing hitchhikers on the road with blonde hair and goes into detail about his envy of them. The delusions grew more intense as the years went by. Davy began to kill the hitchhikers and scalp them, hoping to create the perfect wig to restore his youth. His latest victim, a missing college student, would have certainly perished had Davy not run out of toupee glue. I closed the shop for 2 weeks, still unable to comprehend that, for the time being, I was cutting the hair of a dead person on Davy's head. I'm not sure if I'll be able to find the courage to reopen. My office phone is cluttered with unread voicemails, inquiring when I'm going to go back to work. I've noticed that one of them is from the county jail. Yesterday, Davy's trial began. I was there in attendance and watched the officers bring Davy out in cuffs. He was bald like his father, minus the scraggly strands of hair hanging off the back of his head. He turned to look at me and grinned. A chill went down my spine. For maybe the first time in my life, I was happy that my hair was brown. There's a reason the government is hiding it from the public. UFOs, UAPs, whatever you want to call them. Soon they're going to have to come clean, at least about parts of it. There's no way they'll be honest about the worst of it. Why it's been secret for so long. I don't expect this to stay up for long. I bet my computer's been bugged for the past 10 years. So look carefully. I want you to be ready. I used to be a wildlife photographer. That's why it was such a shock to me When men in black suits show up at your house, tell you that you've been selected for a new job working for NASA, you'd expect they'd be looking for a physicist, or a biologist, or something. I thought it was a joke until one of them flashed a badge. The other one stretched just so, accidentally revealing the gun he was concealing at his waist. I wasn't even a particularly good wildlife photographer. Maybe that's why they chose me. No awards, no family, no friends, no criminal record. Hell, I didn't even have any pets. Guess that was all they needed. Had to take a plane there for my first day. New housing on site, they said. Pack lightly. My new post was at the High Point Special Facility. Maybe you've heard of it in the news. It's a government compound out in the mountains, not too far from Washington, D.C., where U.S. leadership is meant to stay if something threatens their safety in the city. Allegedly, it's owned and operated by FEMA. So why would I work there? Because they've been lying. Under the facility, there are miles and miles of tunnels, fortified, maze-like corridors and rooms expansive enough to create a dark, cool, subterranean city. There were laboratories, libraries, a factory, aircraft hangars, surgical theaters. They needed a documentarian. Didn't want to waste someone more important on taking pictures. I don't think I was even really working for NASA, even if nobody said otherwise. At first, I didn't really understand what I was taking pictures of. I wasn't stupid enough to ask. I assumed they chose someone who couldn't make sense of it on purpose. I'd be taken to a room where there'd be some machine parts or an engine sitting out on a table. I'd take pictures, supervised by people in lab coats who would direct me to certain portions or angles. Over time, pieces got more complete. One time I took a picture of some sort of circuit-looking thing that shorted out my camera after I got too close. Just came apart in my hands, with a burst of blue sparks. Burned me pretty bad. Had to switch from digital to film after that. And then one day it clicked. Maybe about a year in, they had me go to the surgical theater, suited me up like a marshmallow in a gas mask. I was to photograph an autopsy. I remember thinking that they must have been a victim of some covert technological experiment gone wrong. But then they wheeled out the body. It wasn't a person at all. It was small, vaguely person-shaped, but it was put together wrong. A sick little part of me almost laughed. It looked like a cartoon alien. Big eyes, big head, gray skin. But then they started cutting into it. And it was very, very real. I had to photograph each organ. I drank myself to sleep that night. Place was big enough to have a bar, even if I couldn't leave to get my own liquor. Guess my reaction was good enough, though, because instead of my regular work the next day, I was sent to a big meeting room. Needed a photographer's input, they said. Make sure I don't talk about this to anyone else. They were given pseudonyms. The head of the project was Aquila, a rough-looking older guy who sounded like he might have been from New York. There were scientists, quiet, smart people. I can't even remember what they were called. Most of what they said flew over my head. I was also introduced to Sagitta, Cygnus, and Canis, our prospective astronauts. I was Pyxis. Cygnus told me this was the name of a constellation shaped like a telescope. I wonder if she thought it was funny. Aquila informed us we were a small part of a greater project. Greater as in greater in scope, but also greater as in grand. They were to help with the development of a manned super camera, Project Antias. The technology I had been photographing had been de-engineered and re-engineered, all with the purpose of developing faster than light travel. They were almost there. Project Antias was meant to practice sending manned craft into deep space. Antias and its crew were to travel to Mars, orbit for about 3 months, and return. This was the first time I decided to speak up. Why am I here? My voice cracked. Because, he replied, we need someone to teach our astronauts about wildlife photography. We need evidence of live extraterrestrials. So my job became accompanying the 3 astronauts as they underwent their training and teaching them about photography techniques in an unstable environment with an unpredictable subject. The Antias's camera was more powerful than anything I'd ever have my hands on, but there was no data to train an AI to look for a moving alien. We had no idea what we might be looking for, really. We'd only ever seen their ships up close after they've been destroyed. It was less eventful for a while. Everyone was focused on Antias. I saw ships enter the hangar, though, not ours. Long, cigar-shaped craft, built from metal that looked like it had been crushed and folded and melted together so many times over it had become smooth. bodies inside without any evidence of a door. Cygnus told me rumors about ships flying up out of the ocean, about cattle being found bloodless and boneless without visible injury, missing children. She told me in whispers, in writing, in looks and gestures. I wasn't meant to know. She felt bad for me. So much information without any answers. One night she slipped into my quarters. It was close to the launch date. She had told our superiors she wanted to thank me. She asked me for a token to take with her, so she could think of me. I gave her my watch. After she left, I found a piece of paper folded into my pocket. It must have come from the library because none of us had access to a computer or to a printer. The paper looked old, worn, like a vintage book from the 70s. It was a photo of a clay tablet, half unburied, from an archaeological dig. It even had those little flags around the hole, and on the tablet were drawings of people. They were looking up at the sky, at other beings with big heads and stubby bodies, beings coming down from the stars. I ripped up the paper and flushed it down the toilet. I couldn't afford to be caught with it. I don't know if Cygnus thought she was helping me by showing me that, or if she just needed someone to share it with, to carry the burden with her. I never got the chance to ask. We were close, too close. I wish she were here to help me explain. Antias left. The first red flag was when the radio refused to work. Rest of the ship was okay though, from what we could tell back home. We weren't meant to receive the first photographs for a couple of weeks. We did, however, receive more visitors. In the meantime, more sightings. I was tasked with editing photographs taken from satellite. I was sent into hangars alone to photograph orbs that spun without a power source, 4-fingered hands that smelled of ammonia, a flat, black mirror 30 feet across, things that felt wrong. The first transmission we received was beautiful. Someone up top had the kindness to let me look. Heavenly bodies in blue and gold and yellow, galaxies spreading like watercolor across the expanse of space, each taken with a delicate human touch. Art, really, but not what they were looking for. Back to silence, back to work, back to little gray corpses and empty hallways. The next spate of images was more unsettling. Again, the first few were gorgeous. A shot of Earth in swirling color, distant stars, Earth's moon, the moons of Jupiter. Something in this next one, a faint outline, inorganic, a ship. No amount of editing could make it clear, though. And silence again. I was slipping up, losing time. I'd look up and hours would pass. Aquila told me I'd be released from my tour of duty at the end of Antias's mission. I wondered if that meant I'd be killed. Antias relayed more photos. A perfect shot of a non-human spacecraft, just like the ones we had here. Something had compressed it so tightly around the middle that it had split in half. Bodies backlit by sunlight, floating in space. Twisted, squat bodies. Another mangled ship. A photograph of the Antias. How? Aquila asked me. How? I don't know, I told him. I didn't teach them how to do that. Foreign objects arrived at the facility more frequently, and in greater numbers. I was busier than ever, alone on the job more than ever. Sometimes I didn't even have time to decontaminate between rooms before a faceless voice on an intercom would tell me to move on to the next one. I was called in to take photographs of an autopsy. No time to put on a hazmat suit. The intercom said just had to go in with the hollowed carcass. It was peeled open, skin and ribs the petals of a fleshy flower. Each organ had been carefully placed in a tray, ready for documentation. Being near the body made my skin tingle, not in a nervous way. I was used to the dead by now. The body was having a physical effect on me. Lights flashed when I blinked. I crept nearer. Nestled in the open cavity of its chest was a watch, slick black with congealed blood. It was my watch. I was dizzy. I was burning, shaking. I clicked my camera before I gave in and stumbled into the hallway to vomit. How? So many people were asking me like I would have an answer. How? I had to take a polygraph. It had my watch. I don't know how. Cygnus had my watch. From Earth, everything aboard the Antias seemed fine, except for the radio. Days passed. My skin reddened and dried and flaked off like a sunburn. They must have decided to trust me again, because they had me return to working. There was another body. My watch, again, was found among its organs. I was asked more questions I couldn't answer. I asked them how many copies of my watch they had already found. They told me I didn't have a high enough clearance to know. More pictures from Antias. Another photograph of the ship. A different one. This one was smashed flat. A hunk of sheet metal fell into the Atlantic Ocean, belonging to Antias, but our Antias was still up there in space. Someone in the organization recovered the Antias from where it crashed in the mountains of Alaska, but we kept receiving visual transmissions from the ship. From Earth, everything aboard the Antias seemed fine. The super camera captured 1,000 copies of the Antias, floating like sleeping whales. Thousands of suspended bodies, backlit, humanoid, and something else was there. Not a black hole. A black hole can't look back, but it was taking things in, eating things, satellites, moons, copying them, crushing them, spitting them back out, changing them. Those mangled bodies, those cigar-shaped ships, each one was from Earth, weren't they? Each autopsy, each one was performed on some version of Sagitta, Cygnus, and Canis. It was all of them. It was always them, and I helped to put them up there with that thing in own my small way. Nobody had answers, at least not ones they were willing to share. One last photograph. Darkness, interrupted only by a horrifying, warm little light. I could feel it looking back at me, radiating malevolence. We never received a transmission from Antias again. My tour was over. They let me leave. Who would believe me? Who did I have left to tell? Here's the thing. I'm dying. Terminal brain cancer, one of a kind. Doctors say they've never seen anything like it. Reminds them of something they'd see in someone exposed to nuclear waste. Must be why the government used me to take pictures instead of some precious scientist. Before I go, I need someone to carry this burden with me. I don't have answers to everything I saw, every rumor I heard, but I saw enough. It was us that we were studying, the Antias and her crew, returned to Earth butchered and broken and put back together into something new. There never were any aliens, but there is something up there, something the government is watching in secret, something that hates humanity enough to use the strings of time and space as instruments of torture. And I do know one thing. In every picture, it was getting closer to Earth. The wind whipped through the trees, sending a cascade of leaves rustling and swirling. The sound of wood on wood cracked as the small gusts of wind hit the green canopy above. I held my breath, hoping that my GoPro would capture the sound. It would make the intro to my video series feel even more authentic. I had been planning this video for weeks. I wanted to capture the beauty of the forest and all its seasons, and I knew that the sound of the wind in the trees would be a key element. I had even chosen a spot with a particularly large canopy as my opening shot. When I scouted the location weeks ago, hey everyone, this is Alex. This is the first in a series of videos on primitive living. I paused, feeling that my opening was too forced and too enthusiastic. That sounded a little too try-hard. I said to myself, I need to be more natural. I took a deep breath and started again. Hi, I'm Alex, and I'm excited to share my passion for primitive living with you. In this series, I'll be showing you how to build shelters, make tools, and find food. An older woman with sandy blonde hair and a dark blouse with khaki shorts approached me. "Excuse me," she said. I turned to her, slightly annoyed. I thought I had nailed the first intro to my video series, but now I would have to start over. A woman with a stack of papers in her hand approached me. She looked tired and stressed, with bags under her eyes that suggested she had not been sleeping well. Her face carried a look of both concern and sadness, as if she had an emotional weight she was dragging along with her. I could see that she was struggling to keep her composure. Her shoulders were slumped and her eyes were darting around as if looking for something. "Excuse me," she said. "Can you help me?" I turned off my microphone and GoPro, knowing that my introduction would have to wait. I nodded for the woman to approach me. The stack of papers in her hand fluttered in the wind. "Sorry to interrupt," she said, "but I was wondering if you had by chance seen this man." She turned one of the papers over to hand it to me. I took the paper and looked at it. The young man in the photo was about my age, with shaggy brown hair and a warm smile. He was hiking in the woods with a backpack slung over his shoulder. The photo looked like it had been taken recently, and the man looked happy and carefree. But below the photo, in bold letters, were the words, "Missing." "I'm sorry, but I haven't seen him," I replied. "My Jacob went hiking in these woods a few weeks ago. He had a camera just like that one." "How long has he been missing?" I asked curiously. 19 days now, she said sadly. Has anyone found any sort of direction he might have headed? The first 2 weeks they had lots of volunteers combing the woods, but no one found a sign of him, and most of them have given up. I'm sorry to hear that, I replied as I took one more look at the man on the paper flyer before tucking it into my pocket. If I see anything, I will make sure to tell the police. She smiled gratefully and said, thank you, be safe out there. A missing man's mother turned and walked over to a few others who looked like they were going for a hike in the woods. I waited for a few moments, then turned my microphone and turned the camera facing me. I had the perfect idea for the intro now. Alright, guys, my name is Alex, and this is the first of what I hope to be many in my series about surviving in the wilderness using only primitive technology. And this isn't for the faint of heart. I just talked to a woman who told me her son recently went missing in these very woods. So, what I am saying is, what I am doing is not for the faint of heart. And don't try this at home. After I had finished, I noticed a man looking at me from the distance. He wore a light camo pants and white shirt, leaned against an older blue truck. His features covered my dirty trucker-style hat. We looked at each other for some time before I noticed him walking over to me. I saw you talking to that boy's mama, he said loudly. His features became clearer as he spoke. I could see the intensity of his brown eyes, the little specks of dirt under them sprinkled across his cheeks. His crooked nose looked as if it had been broken years ago and never set correctly. Been missing for almost 3 weeks. Yeah, been about that time, I reckon. Do you have any ideas of what might have happened to him? I think he learned a hard truth in those woods, he replied, spitting up and then placing some more chewing tobacco into his bottom lip. He looked at me for a moment, his eyes lingering on my camera. A small gust of wind blew through us, as if we were in a standoff. Hard truth, that he ain't ever leaving the woods. So, he is still alive, you think? I asked with a puzzled tone. Why haven't they found him? Or any clues then? Because he don't want to be found, the man responded curtly. That doesn't make any sense. It would make sense if you were him, he responded, wiping his bottom lip after spitting on the ground once more. His statement only left me more confused as I tried to think of a follow-up question that wouldn't get a cryptic answer. So, is he trying to just get attention? Or something? If anything, I think the boy is happy that the attention is finally dying down. God damn it. He was cryptic again. Well, okay then, I replied. Sun will set in a couple of hours, and I need to get a fire going before then. Keep a close eye of your surroundings out there, the man said before turning around to walk back over to his truck. As I watched him hop into it, I turned my camera back on and began to venture into the woods. I listened to the cackle of burning wood as the flames danced below the cast iron pot I had brought with me. I kept my hands steady and waited patiently. A little bit of steam was rising from the pot, and I knew it was a great shot for my series. I turned the camera to my face and said, "Hey everyone, so I am settled in for the night and just making some water for my journey tomorrow. It has been a wild first day out here, but I am excited to see what day 2 brings. So, with that, I am going to hit the hay soon, and I will see you all in the morning." I turned my camera towards the moon, its silvery light casting a soft glow on the forest around me. I settled onto my bed for the night, a simple pallet of boughs and sticks that I had gathered earlier that day. I had layered the boughs thickly so that they were soft and comfortable, and I had added a few sticks underneath for extra support. I filmed the bright stars and half moon for a few seconds, capturing their beauty in the camera's lens. Then I powered off the camera and set it aside. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, savoring the moment. I thought about all the footage I had filmed that day, and I knew it would be perfect for my first video. I have to admit, for my first time trying something like this, I was surprisingly good at it. I closed my eyes and tried to settle myself on my makeshift bed for the night. The sound of crickets chirping and owls hooting surrounded me, almost lulling me to sleep. Then I heard it, a twig snapping. I froze. I didn't think much of it at first, but then I heard another one. This one was closer. My eyes snapped open and I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. I looked around my campsite, but nothing was there. The fire was dwindling down and the light was becoming dimmer. Another crack came from behind one of the trees. "Hello," I called out, my voice with a slight tremble. There was no answer. I sat there for a moment, listening. The only sound was the crickets and owls. My nerves began to settle, and I started to lay back down when I heard the sound of something snorting, as if it was struggling to breathe. I stood up and got myself out the sticks and boughs. The sound was coming behind the trees, to the left of me, the sound of crunching leaves, as if something was coming towards me. "Hello," I said it again, but nothing replied. I pulled my flashlight out of my pack and shone it over to whatever was hiding behind the trees. The light reflected off a single dark eye. I stepped closer and saw jagged horns and brownish-looking fur. The side of its head peeked out from behind the tree, and I realized what had been lurking around me: a large deer. I took a breath of relief, but I was slightly confused. The deer are usually afraid of humans, especially in areas where hunting is common. I figured that a deer would want to stay as far away from a potential predator as possible. "Well, hello there," I said, wishing I had my camera handy. It was quite the sight at first. It snorted again, as if it was sneezing. I decided to take another step towards it, but I stopped as it turned its head. Something was not quite right. The other side of its face was covered in what looked like a mixture of pus-covered warts and bleeding open sores. The other eye was bulging almost out of its socket. It snorted again, and a green-colored mucus came out of a snout that was crusted over with a similar color. Me and the beast stared at each other as I paused. It reared its head down, pointing its antlers at me. "Damn," I screamed and dodged out of the way just in time. The creature crashed into a tree, and I took the opportunity to run. I didn't look back as I sprinted through the woods. My legs started to ache, but that feeling quickly went away as I heard the sound of the deer screaming from my campsite, its hooves crushing the leaves and sticks on the ground below. It was coming for me. I looked back behind me, but there was nothing but darkness. I could hear the faint sound of the animal somewhere, but I couldn't see it. I just kept running, my lungs struggling in my chest. Suddenly, I heard a loud boom echo through the woods. I stopped running and listened. There it was again, another boom. It was the sound of a gunshot. I didn't know who was shooting, nor did I know where the shots were coming from. I could no longer hear the sound of the deer behind me, but I knew that wasn't the only thing I had to worry about. I realized that I also had no idea how to get back to my campsite. I tried to focus my eyes and see if they could see any glimpse of the fire I had built. The only idea was trying to retrace my steps and hope that those gunshots had taken down my pursuer and that they would not turn that same gun on me. I walked slowly, looking on directions, hoping I would get lucky to see something that resembled the fire. I took each step as quickly and as quietly as possible. I noticed something strange though. The critters and bugs were quiet. I didn't hear the sound of crickets nor the sound of owls anymore. It was almost haunting. I continued to walk through the dark woods, my footsteps echoing off the trees. The only sound was the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Suddenly, I heard something break the silence. It sounded like humming, but it was coming from nowhere. I could see. I stopped and listened. A melody filled my ears, one I couldn't place. But I knew one thing: it wasn't an animal. It was a human. I started moving towards the sound, hoping to find another camper, or at least the person who had the gun. I followed the sound of the humming, hoping to see another campfire, but instead I was greeted by a figure hiding in the shadows. I pointed my flashlight in the direction and saw a shirtless man kneeling with his hands playing in the dirt. The man was tall and thin, with long, scraggly hair that went down to his shoulders. The hair on the top of his head was thin and balding, almost exposing the crown. His skin was pale and dirty, and his eyes were wide and unfocused. He was still humming a low, monotonous tune. "Hello," I asked nervously. The man didn't respond. He just kept humming and playing in the dirt. "Hey, are you okay?" I asked again. The man finally looked up at me, but his eyes were vacant. He didn't seem to recognize me. I asked the man his name, but he didn't answer. He just stared at me with those empty eyes. I moved my flashlight to his bare chest and saw something familiar. The warts I had seen earlier, now with open sores oozing from below his neck down to his stomach. I moved the light up to his face and saw that the warts were spreading, now from his neck to the bottom of his chin. But that wasn't what chilled me to the bone. It was his eyes. They were no longer vacant. They were filled with a dark and intensity. He struggled to stand upright, almost wobbling. He coughed up the same green mucus as the deer before him. In a flash, he took one step and then sprinted towards me, lunging at me. We crashed to the ground with a thud. He screamed in agony. I screamed at the top of my lungs, "Get off me!" He didn't listen, but instead began ripping at my shirt with his nails, clawing like a wild animal. My eyes widened when I saw the tattoo of the tree on his arm. It was the same tattoo that the missing man had, whose mother had given me a flyer about earlier that day. "Help!" I cried out as I struggled to try to get the wild man off of me. He continued to try to scratch and claw. I tried to roll, push, and even threw a punch, but it didn't matter. I was going to die by a diseased hippie who had gotten lost. A loud gunshot rang out, briefly piercing through the sound of my screams. My ears began to ring, and I felt something warm and wet pour onto my shirt. I looked down and saw that it was blood coming from a hole in my attacker's chest. Another shot rang out, and the sound echoed off the trees around me, making my ears ring even more intensely. "Get up," a voice said from the darkness. I was still disoriented, but I could make out a dirty and callous hand reaching out to me. I took it and allowed myself to be pulled to my feet. I looked up and saw that my savior was the man from earlier that day, the one who had given me cryptic answers. I stood up and brushed myself off to see the man holding a rifle at the body. He spit some more tobacco onto the ground. He lowered the gun after a minute and turned around before he started to walk away from the scene. "Where the hell are you going?" "I'll be right back." "You just wait here with this corpse with warts and pus?" "No thank you." I said I will be right back. He responded curtly, "No, screw that. I am coming with you. It will be just a few minutes. One of us has to stay with the body." "No, I am calling the police," I responded, frustrated. "It would take them forever to get out here," he responded as he packed more tobacco into his lower lip. I stood there shaking from adrenaline and feeling that he could turn the gun at me at any moment. "If you just wait a few minutes, I will take you back to my RV, and then we can call the cops." I watched him disappear into the tree line, speechless. I glanced at the body lying motionless on the bed of leaves, sticks, and dirt. It had not moved yet, so that was something. I looked down at my bloodstained shirt and saw some scratch marks on my arms. I spat on the body and muttered, "What the hell is happening here?" I heard a noise approaching, the sound of wheels crunching, and struggling through the underbrush. A small light shone on me, and I saw the man on an ATV. He hopped off and said, "Help me with the body." I don't know why I listened to him. The body was heavy and awkward to move, but I managed to get it onto the ATV. A man took a few minutes to secure the body in place, using ropes to tie it to the back of the vehicle. When he was finished, he climbed back onto the ATV and said, "Ain't enough room for both of us, so you are just leaving me here." "I ain't leaving you, but you are gonna have to hoof it," he answered, pointing into a direction. "If you keep going straight, you will find an open field." "Okay, in that open field is my RV, and I will be waiting there. Cops should show up not too long after that." He revved the engine for and pulled off, cutting through a pair of trees. I waited a moment and took a breather before following the sound of the ATV. The walk was much longer than the man had made it sound. I could feel the sweat pooling on my forehead and my bloodstained shirt sticking to my back. My mouth was dry and my tongue felt like sandpaper. I continued to walk forward in the darkness, mindful of each step and hoping for no more surprises. The trees creaked and swayed in the wind, their branches groaning as they bent and flexed. The wind was cool, but it did little to relieve my sweat-soaked skin. I was exhausted and sweating profusely from hiking late at night. My legs ached and my lungs burned, but I kept going, hoping that the end was near. Finally, the trees began to thin out. I could see a field in the distance, and my heart leapt. I took a deep breath and pushed on, my pace quickening. Soon, I emerged from the woods and into the field. The cool night air felt refreshing, and I could see the stars twinkling overhead. I had made it, and it was a shame I didn't have my camera. I saw some dim lights in the distance, and what looked like the shape of a small trailer. I kept pushing forward, but my body was starting to feel limp. My pace slowed, and my vision began to blur. The stars in the distance seemed to glow even brighter. Almost there, I muttered to myself, mustering up more strength. I could see the RV getting closer, and the ATV sitting next to the man's beat-up truck. The door opened, and the man stepped, placing a shovel outside the door. He watched as I struggled to make it over to him. "Took you long enough," he shouted. "Well, you didn't tell me I had to walk 5 damn miles. It's more like maybe a mile and half," he replied, looking me over for a moment. "You alright? My legs are tried. Thought you were an outdoorsman." I ignored his comment, and he motioned for me to come inside. The RV was filthy with dirty dishes and clothes piled up everywhere. The smell of stale food and sweat hung in the air. Empty plastic bottles full of the man's spit were scattered on the floor and countertops. The only light came from a single bare light bulb in the center of the ceiling. The walls were covered in peeling paint, and the furniture was old and stained. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me as I stepped inside. A man gestured to a table and said, "Take a seat over there." He grabbed a can of air freshener from the table and sprayed it around the RV, trying to cover up the awful smell. "It didn't work. Sorry, I don't have much company, as you can see," he said. "I can't imagine someone as charming as you lacking friends," I replied. The man chuckled. "You thirsty?" he asked. I nodded. A man made his way over to the cabinets and shuffled around, looking for a glass. I glanced around the RV and noticed the rifle leaning against the door. "Thanks," I said. That hike worked up a thirst. The man opened the fridge and pulled out a small jug of water that was covered in dirt, but the water looked clean, and at this point, I didn't care. I just wanted something to drink. He twisted off the top of the jug and handed it to me. "I see you found the missing boy," he said. I took a sip of the water and looked at him. "What happened to him?" I asked. "He got the sickness that lurks in these woods." "Sickness? Hey, first time I've ever seen it hit a person. I am confused." "Ain't nothing to be confused about," he said as he handed me the glass of water and said, "Here you go." I took a sip and watched him go back to the fridge. He grabbed a can of cheap beer and popped it open. He took a long sip, then gazed at me. "Actually, a lot to be confused about. Where did he get this sickness?" "He got it from one of the animals. I am guessing myself." "The animals?" "Yep, they come out at night, get covered in them bumps and wounds. Makes them turn aggressive, too. I saw a deer earlier tonight that looked like that," I replied, taking another sip of water. I had hoped that would moisten my dry mouth, but it did not. The man took a step over to me and sat right across from me. His eyes bore into me, making me feel uneasy. "Probably the same that I put some lead in," he replied, while taking another long sip of beer. "Been taking them out for years. And before me it was my daddy. So, you some sort of guardian angel of the woods?" "I reckon something like that." I became more unnerved by everything he was telling me and asked, "So when should the police be here?" "I haven't called them yet," he said as he stood up and walked back over to the cabinets. I could hear him shuffling around as if he was looking for something. I felt a tension in the RV and I took another sip of water. "I can call them," I said as I reached into my phone. The man stopped shuffling and turned to look at me. "No," he said, "I'll call them." He turned back to the cabinets and continued to look for something. I felt a knot of apprehension in my stomach. Something wasn't right. I didn't know why, but I had a bad feeling. The man slammed the cabinet door, and I looked to see him holding a small pistol in his hand. He walked back over to me and sat back down. "Gonna need you to put down that phone." "Listen, if it's about shooting the guy," I said with my voice trembling. "I didn't see anything, and we can both go our merry way." "Ain't about that. I don't have any money either." "Ain't about that neither," I shouted in a panic. "Then what is this about?" The man took a deep breath and took another swig from his beer before tossing the empty can aside onto another pile of trash in his room. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and looked at me with a cold, calculating expression. "This is about you," he said. "You're sweating buckets over there." I stared at him, my stomach feeling even more sick. "What do you mean?" I asked. "You got it from him," he replied and placed his tightened grip on his gun. He motioned his eyes to my arms. I looked down in shock to see tiny little bumps forming around the scratch mark. I had been looking for that boy, hoping to find him before he spread that stuff to anyone else. That's why no one could find his stuff. I gulped. The man nodded and said, "I disposed of it, and I've been hunting him until tonight." Why didn't he just leave? I think he was too afraid to die to kill himself, but at least selfless enough to stay away from other people. He then pointed the gun at me and said, "I don't think you have the same stomach as him to live in the woods. and turn into whatever the hell I saw. I just want to go to the hospital. I can't allow that, the man responded. He pointed the gun at me and rested his finger on the trigger. I started to shake, and suddenly I began to cough. I felt something begin to creep up my throat. It was thick and green, and it left my mouth, hitting the table below. It was the same green mucus I had seen both the deer and the man expelled earlier. The man jumped up quickly from the table, as he was scared of it. It ain't personal, but I can't let the sickness leave the woods. I take being shot personally, I replied as I tried to think of anything. The man lifted his gun, and I looked over to a air freshener, quickly grabbing it and spraying it on his face. He was taken back, and he tried to steady his aim, but I quickly ran out the door. "You little piece of trash," he screamed as I stumbled out of the RV and fell to the ground. I heard the sound of crashing and falling coming from inside. I knew I wouldn't be able to run back to the woods. He would grab his rifle, and he seemed like a good shot. I was cooked if I went that route. I did the only thing I could do with what little I could see. My body felt weak and was working on adrenaline. I lifted myself and quickly grabbed the shovel. I could hear the man also making his way to the door. The sound of his foot hitting the door meant he could see again. I used the last bit of strength I could muster and swung the shovel at him. My hands tingled as the man's facial bones collided with the metal of the shovel. It sounded like a crunch as I could see the man's bloody face look stunned. He still held onto the rifle, but his grip was starting to weaken. I lifted the shovel again and hit him again across the face. He collapsed, dropping the rifle to the ground. He spat up blood and stared at me with anger. "If you leave, you could spread the sickness," he said. I lifted the shovel up again, holding it above my head. It was either him or me at this point, and I of course chose me. I felt the crown of his head crack from the shovel. I watched as he fully collapsed face down on the ground, blood coming from his ears. I walked over to the truck and could see the keys still in the ignition. It meant I had a way to escape the woods even with the sickness. In the early 2000s, there used to be this music station for kids called Cool Kids FM radio, and it was booming with a bunch of kids and parents in my town. Even I was hooked on it when my parents played it in the car, so my virgin ears weren't tainted. Cool Kids radio played songs with genres ranging from bands like Simple Plan to some generic rap anthems that were acceptable for kids to listen to, and of course rarely but surely censor words when needed. Based on what I just said, there should be no issues at all happening with the station. However, there was one day in particular where I remember riding around in the car with my mom on a Friday afternoon after school, tending to her errands. As we drove into the post office's parking lot, she asked if I wanted to keep the car on to listen to the radio, and I obliged, as I didn't bring my DS with me, so music was the next best thing. I cycled through some stations until I stopped at Cool Kids FM. At the time I was in middle school, and the last time I listened to the station was when I was 8, so I thought it couldn't hurt to get all nostalgic. Crush 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 by Paramore was playing, and as I was getting lost in the song, a sharp static noise cut through and completely trashed the audio. Wincing from the sound, I reached for the volume slider, but the static suddenly stopped. A minute of absolute silence was off-putting, and then as if it had a jolt of life, the radio regained its audio. There wasn't any music playing though, and there wasn't an announcement for technical difficulties. There was just a long beep, and all of a sudden a voice that I could only describe as gravelly and rough started saying numbers: 7, 19, 45, 6, 15, 44, 9, 1, 50, 29, 31, 25, 0, 5. Those are the numbers I remember at least, because when I woke up I found myself in the hospital. There were bandages on my arms and thighs, and I was surrounded by my mom, dad, and my 2 younger brothers. I sat there confused and wondered how I even got into this position. "What's going on?" I asked, puzzled and still groggy from the pain medication that was in my system. My mom shot daggers at me with her eyes. It looked like she had been crying for hours. "What's going on is that I came back into the car to you hurting yourself. What were you thinking?" My mom shot back at me, barely containing her emotions. "Hurting myself? I had only blacked out for 5 minutes at most, so how could I have hurt myself if I blacked out?" My mind was racing feverishly, trying to answer questions that I had no knowledge about. I stumbled for words to tell my mom, and how to make "I don't know" sound like a reasonable explanation. Just then, as if they popped up from thin air, these two men wearing suits came into my room. "You must be the Thompsons, right? The one with the biscuit?" And Thin Beard spoke suddenly as he knocked on the hospital door. My dad shot straight up from his seat. "Yes, could I ask who you two are? This is a private family matter," he responded with a firmness in his voice. A man with the biscuit pulled out a badge, and the one with slicked hair followed suit. "Apologies, I'm Agent Kensler, and this is Agent Wilson. We're with the CIA." I looked at both of them with wide eyes and started slowly putting together the events in my head. "There's been cases similar to your son regarding certain radio station incidents. We wanted to ask your son and your wife a few questions, if that would be okay with you," Agent Kensler said, keeping his stoic attitude when he spoke. My dad obliged and took my younger brothers out of the room. They took one last look at me with tears in their eyes and slowly walked out of the room. My father was closely behind them, patting their backs and escorting them out solemnly. Kensler then pulled up a chair next to my bed and started his array of questions. "So Roy, could you tell me what you remember from earlier today?" he asked as he pulled out a notepad and a pen. I told him that I only remembered turning to Cool Kids FM and listening to the songs, when suddenly the static cut the signal and the numbers started to play when it came back on. I told him that after I heard the numbers I blacked out. I thought I had just fallen asleep or something. My mom, however, told the detectives the events of what happened after I blacked out, and it chilled me to my very core. My mom was coming back to the car after sitting in the long line waiting to drop off her package. As she was getting closer to the car, she saw me sitting perfectly still, just sitting still and looking forward. I didn't dare to move an inch, and even when my mom was close enough for me to hear her footsteps, I refused to move. Feeling uneasy, she hurried over to her side and opened the door. That's when she saw me with slashes across my arms and stabbing myself in the legs in a rhythmic fashion with a box cutter that was in the glove compartment. She then said I looked over and flashed the most unnerving grin while having tears in my eyes and showing her the fresh cuts on my wrist. She said she started to cry as she took the box cutter from me and screamed at me to snap out of whatever I was in. But it was only when she turned off the radio did I completely go limp. She started to panic, but quickly pulled herself together as she then used whatever she could find to try to stop the bleeding as much as possible until we got to the hospital. I could tell by her face as she recalled these events that she was scared out of her mind, especially since I was considered touch and go due to the fair amount of cuts I inflicted on myself. Agent Kensler, hearing all that he had to hear, thanked us for our cooperation and headed out the door with Agent Wilson following closely behind him. I spent the night in the hospital wondering about the other kids that could have heard that number broadcast and had nightmares, wondering what they did once they heard it. That following morning I was discharged and tried my hardest to find Cool Kids FM on the radio I had in my room. To my surprise, there was no more Cool Kids FM, and all that was left in place from the station frequency was white noise. No numbers, no songs, just static. I found out later on that a lot of kids in my area died from bizarre suicides, biting their tongues, jumping out of moving cars, slashing their wrists, and the list kept piling on and on. I was one of the lucky ones that survived. We held a vigil for the lives of the children the week after the incident. It was peaceful, and at the same time you could feel the somber air suffocate you. Cool Kids FM became a defunct radio station after this particular incident because even if they were hijacked like they claimed to be, it was too much of a risk to keep running. I still tune into the station from time to time, seeing if the static will crackle and gain life once more, but to this day all I hear is the static. Sometimes I even hear the numbers faintly, but I put it off as just my imagination. Maybe it was just survivor's guilt rotting my brain, or maybe, somewhere in the static, the numbers are still there, patiently waiting to be listened to once again. Chris, what is this? Marcus, my younger brother, yelled from the kitchen, trying to get my attention. Rolling my eyes, I stopped scrubbing the bathtub and sat back against the wall. "What the hell do you want now?" I responded, annoyed. It was summer vacation, and since my parents both worked full-time jobs, and we lived in the middle of nowhere, they decided it was a great day to have Marcus, and I cleaned the entire house from top to bottom. You know, seeing as how we had nothing better to do, just come in here and see this, and don't cuss, or I'll tell Mom, Marcus yelled with his own tone of annoyance. Sighing audibly in aggravation, I stood to my feet and left the bathroom. As I walked down the hallway toward the kitchen, I thought about how much cleaning we had left to do. Each step I took only increased my irritation with Marcus for wasting our time with something that probably didn't even matter. Being 9 years old, he had a tendency to get distracted while we were doing chores. This was far from the first time he'd interrupted my cleaning that day to show me some dead bug, or especially large dust bunny. But since I was a few years older than him, 3 to be exact, he often called for me to throw things he thought were gross away. I guess it was my duty, as the older brother, to watch over him and his eyes. I didn't like the idea at the time, but looking back on it now, what I once viewed as annoying little sibling habits I now view as fond memories. Anyways, after walking into the kitchen, I saw Marcus just standing in front of the sink, almost motionless. "Marcus," I asked, "what the hell are you doing?" He turned to look at me, his face a little pale. "Just come here and see already, and stop cussing," he replied with a hurried tone. Rolling my eyes again, I moved toward him in the sink, getting ready to put him in a headlock for wasting my time. "I swear to God, if this is another dead spider, I'm gonna—" My words caught in my throat as my eyes finally fell upon what he wanted me to see. The cabinet beneath the sink was where we stored much of the cleaning supplies for the kitchen. Bleach, rubber gloves, sponges, things like that. But even with the cabinet doors wide open, I didn't see any of the usual household items we kept there. Instead, there was a gaping tube leading downward at an angle, the rim of which appeared to be a sort of red plastic material. "Whoa," is all I could say in my shocked state. "I told you," Marcus said accusingly as he stood beside me. I stepped in front of the cabinet entrance and kneeled down to get a closer look. Making sure it wasn't an optical illusion, I raised a hand and stuck it into the tube. Unsurprisingly, it went beyond the entrance with no resistance. Pulling my appendage back and peering down the cylindrical hole, I squinted, trying to see where it led. But it was no use. The red color of the tube was visible for maybe 15 or 20 feet before being swallowed entirely by darkness. Sitting back on my feet, I said, "It looks like a—" Marcus cut me off. "A slide." "It's a slide," he said, a little excitement in his voice. I nodded, bewildered, as I touched the smooth, slippery material of the cylinder's entrance. "But what would a slide be doing here?" I asked, confused. "We don't have a basement, so where would it even go?" I looked to my brother for an answer, but behind his excited exterior, it was clear that he was as puzzled as I was. "Maybe it was supposed to be a surprise from Mom and Dad?" he asked, outlining the edges of his question. I shook my head. "No way. We would have noticed if they installed a friggin' slide under the kitchen sink." "I guess you're right." Marcus' gaze sank to the floor, seemingly unsure of how to respond to my argument. Standing up, I walked toward my parents' room. My brother turned to face me and asked, "Where are you going?" "To grab Dad's flashlight," I responded, already opening the door to our parents' bedroom. Our father had an especially powerful flashlight, but it was so excessively bright that he kept it on a shelf in their closet, unaware that my brother and I knew of its location and had used it on multiple occasions. When our parents were out, I figured if we wanted to see the bottom of the slide, Dad's flashlight should do the trick. After grabbing it, I walked back out to the kitchen where Marcus stood waiting for me. I waved the flashlight around proudly as he smirked back at me in excited curiosity. "Okay, let's see how far this baby goes," I said as I kneeled down in front of the crimson slide, my own curiosity making me equally as excited as my brother. Careful not to point the powerful bulb of the handheld light at either mine or Marcus's face, I switched it on. Instantly, the dark chasm beneath the sink was brightly illuminated. For a second, I thought we were about to make some big discovery, but as I directed the beam down the center of the slide, I furrowed my brow in frustration. What the hell? I said in surprise as I gazed down into the abnormality. I still can't see the bottom. Puzzled, my brother stuck his head just a bit into the slide's now brightly lit entrance. A simple "wow" escaped his lips as he too stared down into the tube. A flashlight must have illuminated more than 50 feet down into the red cylinder, but at the end of its powerful beam still sat nothing but a pitch black abyss. Not wanting to waste the battery any longer, I turned the flashlight off and set it on the counter next to the sink. Marcus stayed kneeling in front of the sink for a moment as I stood beside him, thinking what our next course of action should be. Both of us were determined to see how far down this mystery slide went and to where. But as I dug through my mind for ideas, he beat me to one. Quickly standing to his feet, Marcus proclaimed, "I know," and without another word he darted down the hallway toward our room. A minute or two later he came back holding something behind his back. A stupid grin smeared across his face. "What is that?" I asked with raised eyebrows. Kicking his feet around nervously, Marcus replied, "Well, I figure if we can't see how far down the slide goes, maybe we can dump something noisy down it and listen for when it hits the ground on the other side." His explanation only increased my confusion, and I asked, "What did you get that will be loud enough?" Giggling like an oaf, Marcus sidestepped around me and toward the kitchen sink, obviously avoiding my question. "Well, it's a," he stuttered out. Growing slightly annoyed, I grabbed his arm and tried to pry whatever he was hiding behind his back from him to see what he had. "Just tell me what you got, dude," I hissed through gritted teeth as I wrestled with him. "It's nothing," he screeched back as he struggled against me. As the two of us fought, he managed to get an arm free, and before I could do anything about it, he had thrown a handful of something shiny and metallic down the red tube. Once the small objects clattered against the hard plastic material and began sliding and rolling down the incline, I realized what he had giddily tossed down the slide. Furious, I grabbed my brother by his shirt collar and nearly screamed at him, "Was that my damn coin collection, you little bastard?" Marcus' laughter caught in his throat at my sudden drastic shift in demeanor. His expression changed to one of fear, and he yelled back, "Jay, just some of it. The coins are really loud, and once they hit the bottom of the slide we should be able to hear them clank against the ground. And don't cuss at me or all," I interrupted him in a childish, mocking tone. "You'll tell Mom and Dad. Maybe I'll tell them how you tossed my coin collection, you little jerk. Who do you think will be in bigger trouble then, huh? I've been collecting those since I was 6. Marcus." My brother's eyes welled up with tears, and he let out a small sorry. I glared daggers into him for a moment, then shoved him away from me, exclaiming, "Ugh, whatever. I might have done worse if not for the fact that the little pest had actually had a decent plan. The coins should make a distinctly different sound when they fall out of the tube and onto the ground, at least assuming there was solid ground on the other side. Still, we didn't know that for sure, and the knowledge that my brother may have just doomed a chunk of my lifelong coin collection pissed me off. "He'd better hope this works," is all I said to him as the two of us listened to the sound of change slipping downward into the earth. The noise echoed back for quite some time, maybe a good half a minute or so, but with each second they sounded further away until we eventually heard nothing at all. As angry as I was that I had just lost some of my prized collection, my confusion outweighed my frustration. "How" is all the English I could muster in my shocked state. Marcus, too, seemed baffled as he stood back up from where I'd pushed him a moment earlier. He looked at me with a mix of guilt and concern before saying, "Chris, I'm sorry." Looking at his face as he started to cry only annoyed me more at the time. Without anything to say to him, I left the kitchen and headed for the storage room. The combination of anger and confusion over the situation clouded my better judgment, but I now had a plan to both get my coins back as well as find out what was at the bottom of that damn slide. A few minutes passed before I returned to where my brother still stood, looking guilty as he fearfully stared down the slide. Turning his attention back to me, he saw what I was carrying, and a new confusion spread across his face. "What's that?" he asked, pointing to what I had slung over my shoulder. "Rope," I answered shortly. Rolling his eyes, Marcus responded, "I know it's rope. What is it for?" As I began tying the rope around the metal leg of our heavy kitchen table, I snarkily answered his question with another one-worded reply, "You." Marcus just kept glaring at me, clearly not understanding what I meant. So once I finished tying off the knot, I explained further, "This is Dad's 100 feet rope. Since you thought it was a great idea to toss my coin collection down the slide, you're going to go and get my coins back." His expression changed to one of horror, and he retorted, "No, no way. I am not doing that. I won't." I cut him off again. "Yes, you are, Marcus. That's what you get." He began crying a little and shaking his head rapidly, letting out an exasperated sigh of irritation. I tried to reason with him. "Dude, stop being a baby. You want to find out how far down the slide goes, right?" He nodded, tears and snot beginning to dribble down his face. "Relax. I'm going to tie the rope around your waist and hold it from up here so you won't fall down. You'll have almost 100 feet of rope. There's no way this thing goes farther than that. And if it does, I'll just pull you back up." Marcus wiped various fluids from his face. "But I don't wanna. It's dark and it's freaking me out. Chris, please don't make me go in there," he begged. "You'll be fine. I promise no matter what happens, I'll hold onto the rope as tightly as possible. Besides, you owe me for losing my coin collection," I argued. I watched him quietly sob for a moment before sighing once more, grabbing his shoulders and bending down to his level. I tried to reassure him. "Come on, Marcus, just think of it like you're an explorer. You're going to go somewhere mysterious and bring back treasure." He angrily shoved me off him and yelled, "I'm not friggin' 5, Chris." Glaring at him, I yelled back, "Fine, you might not be 5, but you act like you are." It was obvious from the way his face contorted that my words stung him, but I kept going anyway. "You're such a wimp. You don't want to go down the slide because you're a little baby who has to have his hand held all the time. How do you expect people to respect you if you can't even go down a damn slide on your own?" I yelled. For a moment, Marcus looked like he was going to cry again, and an overwhelming amount of guilt came over me. I'd never talked to my brother that way before. Sure, we didn't always get along perfectly, but he was still my little brother and I loved him. Giving him crap once in a while was one thing, but I started to realize I'd taken things too far. I opened my mouth to apologize, but before I could, Marcus snatched the rope from my hand and began tying it around his waist. Watching him in surprise, I simply asked, "Marcus?" But this time, he cut me off. "Shut up, Chris. I'll do it, okay?" Shame shot up my neck, and I realized in that moment how badly I wanted to call the whole thing off. But with Marcus's newly found bravery, I felt like it would only be further insulting to him to do so now. "Here, let me tie it for you," I began, but my brother pulled away. "No, I've already got it, and you suck at tying knots anyway." I laughed and decided to let him have that one, seeing as how I treated him earlier. Once the rope was tied snugly around his waist, Marcus grabbed Dad's flashlight and knelt down before the entrance to the ominous slide, his back facing it. Feeling a little proud of him, I cheered him on. "All right, man, you've got this." He rolled his eyes and said, "Duh." With that, he began slowly making his way backwards down the slide. I watched his face as he grew further and further into the darkness. As I slowly fed him more and more of the rope, a cold dread began to crawl up my spine as the coil of rope beside me slowly decreased. But seeing Marcus shining the bright flashlight from where he was brought me at least some comfort. "How are you doing, Marcus?" I called down the long red tube after him. For a moment, there was no response, and anxiety began to spread like sweat across my back. But to my great relief, my brother soon replied, "I'm okay." His voice echoed back up the slide, sounding far away. Glancing over to check how much rope was left, and seeing that it wasn't much, I grew more nervous. My mind began swimming with awful scenarios. Marcus must have gone down at least 75, maybe 80 feet by now. I could barely even make out the pinprick of light from our dad's flashlight from how far down he'd climbed, and my paranoia was only getting worse with each second that passed. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore, and I called down to Marcus once more. "Hey, Marcus, I think you should come back up now. The rope is almost out." "What?" Marcus called back, sounding farther away than ever before. I said, "It's time to abort the mission. I'm pulling you up now." "No, wait," he yelled, practically from the other side of the planet. "I think I can almost see the bottom." By this point, the rope was completely taut, and my fear far outweighed my curiosity. It didn't help that I could only barely hear him from how far down he was. I no longer cared about what lay at the bottom of this abomination. I just wanted my brother safely back. It doesn't matter, just come back up. Now, Marcus, I yelled down at him, trying not to sound too panicked. He yelled something back, but it was inaudible. Not wanting to argue further with him, I gripped the rope and yelled at him once again to climb back up and forget about the whole thing. But just as the last words left my mouth, I heard a strange hissing sound from behind me. Then, without warning, I found myself nearly being pulled down into the slide face first as the rope began falling quickly into its depths. A short scream of abject terror blasted through the claustrophobic cylinder as Marcus began plummeting down into the darkness, well beyond what I could see. I scrambled to catch the rapidly shortening rope, but due to the horrible burning it inflicted upon my hands, I wasn't able to get a good grip on it until nearly its end. Through gritted teeth, I called out in pain for my brother, Marcus. I heard screaming and crying echoing back through the slide as my brother called for help. Faintly, I was able to make out, "Chris, what's happening? Pull me back up. I'm trying," I yelled through a pained expression. My legs strained as I pushed against the entrance to the slide with all the strength I could muster. I pulled at the rope as hard as I could, but the harsh burns on my hands stung agonizingly from my tight grip. More faint screams and pleading could be heard from Marcus as he thrashed around in the slide. I could practically feel his desperation reverberate up through the rope as he tried to climb his way back through the dark, blood-tinted tube. But after what felt like an eternity, I could feel the rope slowly slipping through my now sweat-coated hands. "Marcus, hurry," I screamed in despair, my cheeks stinging with tears from a mix of pain and terror. "Chris" is the only word I could make out among the otherwise inaudible sounds that shot up the slide. With each passing second I could feel the rope slipping more and more from my ever-weakening grip. The pain of my burns was excruciating, and my muscles ached intensely, but I refused to give up. This whole thing was my fault, and I couldn't bear the thought of my brother plummeting down this seemingly endless slide because of me. All that said, each passing second the pain grew stronger and my resolve weaker. By now, so much of the rope had slipped through my bloody grip that only a few inches of it remained. At long last, however, my brother's terrified expression became visible in the darkness. He was almost back up now. "Chris," he sobbed as his hands clawed up the rope and his legs thrashed about, struggling to get a grip against the smooth, slippery plastic inside of the slide. "Marcus," I cried in return, the pain in my hands reaching an unbearable level as I did my best to hold on. Marcus continued his way back toward me, sobbing uncontrollably all the while. His panicked movement made it all the more difficult to keep my grip upon the last inch of rope. "Don't let go," he screamed. I won't," I strained through gritted teeth. He was almost back at the top, and I wasn't going to let him fall now. At least, that's what I kept telling myself, the statement repeating in my mind like a mantra over and over again. But just as he was nearing me, maybe just about 10 feet or so away, I suddenly began to feel an increase in weight on the rope. At first, I thought it was just because my body was getting weak, but when I gazed through blurred vision down at the extra rope that should have been hanging slightly behind Marcus, I could see that it was now taut. It was as if it was caught on something deeper in the slide, or being pulled by something. Panic rose in my chest as I pleaded with Marcus to hurry, but after another second, I felt a strong pull against the few inches of rope I had remaining. Although it didn't cause me to immediately lose my grip, it did cause Marcus to trip within the slide, and the shock that echoed up the few feet of rope left between us was just enough to cause the last bit of it to slip from out of my now blood-soaked grip. The most horrible, gut-wrenching scream shattered through the slide as I watched my brother's terror-stricken face fade into the blackness. A broken scream of my own gnawed its way out of my sobbing throat. "Marcus" was all I could manage as I listened to his awful screams as they slowly got farther and farther down into the bowels of the horrible red tube. I sat there in stunned silence until I could no longer hear any sound from the slide. Then, my senses coming back to me, I ran to grab the phone off the wall and called my father. I tried to explain in panic, jumbled sobs what had happened, as my poor dad did his best to make out my words. He kept asking where Marcus was but didn't understand what I meant when I said he fell down the slide. I walked back into the kitchen still carrying the phone as I tried desperately to make my father understand the situation. But when I stepped back in front of the sink, my words caught in my throat and caused me to nearly choke on my tongue. The underside of the sink no longer housed the bright, painfully red playground equipment. Instead, what sat mockingly beneath the familiar repetitive dripping appliance was the equally familiar sight of a cabinet filled with nothing more than a variety of mundane cleaning supplies. I stood there, unable to process what I was looking at as my father yelled for an explanation on the other side of the phone. I couldn't bring myself to respond to him, and after a moment of silence on my end, he at last yelled in a panicked voice, "I'm coming home," and I heard the line go dead. When he arrived home about 20 minutes later, my dad found me standing in the very same spot I'd been when the call ended, just staring into the cabinet with wide eyes filled with terror and confusion. He grabbed my shoulders and demanded I tell him where my brother was. When I didn't reply, his angry demeanor crumpled into one of desperation, and he began begging me to tell him where Marcus was. My father wasn't the type of man to show much emotion beyond anger, but something in his concerned and scared tone caused my eyes to swell with tears. Although I cried, I still could not find the words to explain to him the circumstances that led to his being home early. I could not cohesively form an explanation for what had taken his youngest son, so instead, I raised my arm and simply pointed into the underside of the kitchen sink. This pale attempt at answering the question, "Where the hell is Marcus?" was not taken well by my father, and while I knew he didn't mean to, his anger and panic got the better of him. He slapped me hard across my snot-soaked face and stormed off to search through our home. I stayed glued to the spot before the sink as I listened to my father rip apart the house, calling for my brother. Moments later, he rushed past me to the back door, and I heard him calling for Marcus Moore in the backyard. I wanted to follow him, to tell him he wouldn't find Marcus out there, to tell him again that my brother had fallen into the slide, but the sting on my cheek convinced me it would be a bad idea. After Dad searched for a bit longer, he finally returned to the back door and rushed to the phone. He picked it off the ground from where I dropped it, ignoring me entirely, and called the police. When they arrived, they searched the premises more thoroughly for any sign of my brother, going through every nook and cranny of the house to no avail. My father did, however, notice that his flashlight and rope were missing, and that's when he came to me and once again begged for answers. When he began to get hysterical, a police officer pulled him away and said that they would talk to me. They sat me down at the dining room table and questioned me. Initially, I was of course hesitant. My father didn't believe me about the slide, so why would they? But after some coaxing, they managed to convince me to tell the story, the whole story. After I was finished, they simply stared at me. Even my 12-year-old brain was able to see plainly that the looks they gave me were accusatory. They tried to spin some story about how my brother had taken my coin collection and that I became angry enough to steal my father's rope and tie him up in the wilderness somewhere to die. They demanded I tell them his whereabouts, but of course, I didn't know where he was. As a result of my story and the missing rope, flashlight, and coin collection, I was detained on suspicion of kidnapping my brother, and a widespread search ensued around the wilderness surrounding our home. When there was no body found, the police decided they didn't have enough evidence to keep me, and I was released back into my parents' custody. Sadly, the lack of evidence wasn't enough to sway my parents that I'd done nothing wrong, and they went on resenting me until I moved out about 6 years later. To this day, I have almost zero contact with them, and I know it's because they still think I had something to do with Marcus's disappearance. I hated them for a long while, but now that I'm nearing my 30s and have children of my own, I think I understand why they blame me. After all, who else was there to blame? My brother is still missing, and even I blame myself for that. I shouldn't have made him climb into that damned slide. We should have just left it alone and waited for our parents to get home, or even just ignored our chores and gone outside to play or something. But I can't change the past. All I can do is look toward the future. I have a family now, and my own children are the most important part of my life. If all this has taught me anything, it's that my children will never go down a slide, especially not one under the kitchen sink.